The interviews, conversations from behind the page, the Eli Marks Podcast. Part 8, The Legends. The Amazing Kreskin.
So let's go back to the very beginning. How did you actually create your Mentalism Act?
Well, that's an interesting question. I had no teachers. I had no models because I've seen very few performers in my life. I just don't get to see performers. I started as a magician years ago, and then, which I've done all over the world. The airline industry announced 2 years ago that I've now flown a little over 3.5 million miles,
Wow.
which I'm told is more than many pilots have, commercial pilots, and a lot of performers have as well. So I have nothing against magic. I mean, it's a great art form and what have you. And I admired magicians. I didn't know many of them. I was just interviewed by a very famous one not long ago. But my model character was a comic book, because when I was 5-6 years old, of course I couldn't read, so my mother would read to me comics, and I have about 200 of original comics, which I prize. And one of the comics was one of the biggest in the Second World War, and that was Mandrake the Magician. He wasn't a magician. He had hypnotic abilities and telepathic abilities and solve crimes and what have you. And that became my model. So when we would go out to play, when we played Cops and Robbers, I played Mandrake. And then in my third grade, Miss Curtis, it was raining outside, and she said to all of us, well, you're not going to go out and play. I'm going to teach you a game. And she sent one of my classmates, I remember Jane Hamilton, I saw her about a year ago, sent her out into the hallway and said, Jane, wait there. And we hid a beanbag. We hid it somewhere in someone's desk. We called Jane back in, and Miss Curtis said, Jane, you walk around. When you're getting near it, we'll say you're getting warm. When you're not near it, you're cold. Old game of hot and cold. And she found it. I was so upset that I didn't get to play it. When I got home, I got a hold of my brother, and we walked over to my grandparents' house at Roseland Avenue. And I said, here, take this penny and hide it upstairs. So anyway, he goes upstairs, and then he calls me. And I'll never forget, I'm only 9 years old. I'm walking upstairs. My grandmother doesn't know what's going on because she didn't speak much English. We loved her dearly. And I found myself wandering into Michael's bedroom. And I climbed up on a chair because I was short. I'll never forget this, a brown chair. And I found myself reaching behind a curtain rod, and there was a penny. And when I climbed down and I went in the kitchen where my brother was, I suddenly realized I forgot to tell my brother to tell me whether I'm getting hot or cold. I forgot to tell him anything. He didn't know what the heck was going on. Grandma, because she's Italian, probably thought I had the evil eye, which was healthy because in those days that became legendary. But that was the beginning of my career. And in grade school, I would do experiments, and 4th and 6th grade performances during show and tell. And then, as I told you, by the time I was in high school, I was doing full shows. So my career, I didn't have a public model or someone I had seen. I rarely saw magicians. I mean, years later, I saw them on TV and what have you. And I liked great sleight of hand artists, great illusionists. But at the same time, that was the beginning of a career that has evolved through the years. And I'm still working busily. I celebrated a few weeks ago my 86th birthday, but I still run 20 minutes every night.
I went through a lot of the videos of your performances online, and one thing kept reoccurring as I watched them, which is that not only is your audience having fun, but you seem to be having a great time.
You said something very special. I appreciate your saying that. It was my work, John, my work is an experience. It's an adventure. I've traveled all over the world. I've even performed and Carson used to find it fascinating when I came back from Japan. He says, your audiences, they speak English? I said, no, a lot of them did not, but there was ways of working with an interpreter and what have you. But so my life, and then 5.5 years off and on in Saudi Arabia. Now that's an experience. I mean, and then I had a series in Canada called The Amazing World of Kreskin, which was on for 5.5 years. The first year was the second highest rated program in the nation. I'm very proud of that. The Canadian people think that I am Canadian because I'm so much a part of, they've seen me from years through the things. Now, if they knew me well enough, they wouldn't want to think that I was Canadian. No, I'm only joking. But at the same time, my life has been really like an adventure. And occasionally I'll meet a magician here and there, but I love to, because of my degree in psychology, experience abnormal behavior. No, I'm only joking.
So you mentioned your performances, and you've done, I don't know if you've added them up. It's got to be thousands and thousands and thousands of performances in front of all kinds of audiences. Have you ever thought about what are the key elements that you want to make for a great show for you?
That's interesting. That's a very interesting question, because I think, first of all, the problem in my not being able to teach someone what I do is that I could do it if I started when they were 5 or 6 or 7 years old, because my career has been an evolution of factors involved that came into the picture and what have you. And then the beauty, the excitement of my work is that there's no footlights between myself and my audience. Yes, there are the lights on the floor there, but footlights meaning barriers, because without the audience, I have no show. But my audience, when I walk out on stage, I think of them as one, as a whole, because they become a unit of mood, experience, and what have you. And when I laugh, I kid them about political. I don't mock politicians because I don't want to get involved in anything like that. But I kid them about what's going on. I give them a spark and what have you, and consequently, it personalizes what I do. So people are not coming to watch something. They really, when they come to my shows, I warn them, for God's sakes, don't come to watch me. Come to be part of the program. Because whether the audience is 30 people or a theater or 4 balconies like Carnegie Hall, or a state fair like 10,000 or 20,000 people, I can make them part of the program. And that's part of the secret of my success. I can't say how I do it because right now it's become kind of a natural thing.
Can I ask a question just
Sure.
about, I know that you never have ever claimed to have any kind of supernatural powers, but that you instead are highly trained. How do you respond to audience members who see your incredible performance, come up to you and say, no, you absolutely have some sort of supernatural power, you're just not admitting it to us?
I never claim to be a psychic. And that's part of my persona. I learned something from the American Indian, whom I've always had great respect for, and that is something we learned as kids in grade school. It's an old saying of the American Indian: "You never judge someone until you walk in their shoes." We don't do that today. We judge them ahead of time. We decide if they say they support someone that we either like them or dislike them. I think, God forbid, what a curse. How could you live in that particular way? But if you walk with people, and I made it a normal thing, Mike, when I met someone when I was 8, 10, 12, 14 years old, I tried to walk the way they did, the same rhythm. And you know what's interesting? After you do that, you start to think of the way they do. There's an instrument that's helping to destroy our culture. It's a very wonderful instrument. It's called a cell phone. But because of this, we don't hear each other anymore. We don't even listen to what each other say, because we can get an answer real quick by just asking the phone and putting it down. Years ago, if you met with someone on a date or a business thing or some other thing, when you finish with them and you left them and you're by yourself, you start to reflect upon what they say. So I've trained hundreds and hundreds of business people how to reflect and learn from an experience they had by sound, by movement, and what have you. And that's part of the secret of my lifestyle. But again, if we can't laugh, we got to be able to laugh at ourselves, because that's part of the spark of life, Phils?
We talked about laughter and how much fun you have with your audience, how much fun the audience has. I have to tell you, in prepping for this, I went online, looked at a lot of videos of you, and there was 1 or 2 appearances with David Letterman where things didn't quite go right.
That's right.
And I've never seen a performer in you, particularly, who enjoyed the fact that something didn't go right as much as you did then, which is quite different than what you would call a standard mentalist. wants everything to go right all the time. You're so open to whatever's going to happen.
It's ironic you bring this up because a gentleman doing research on me 2 days ago mentioned David Letterman. You have to understand something that's not happening as much in broadcasting anymore. Broadcasting is becoming, the nighttime shows are becoming true program. But you have to understand that that's the key. When there's humor and spontaneity, it is run with the thing. Take advantage of the spontaneity, because that makes it more of an adventure. I'll tell the story now because it was one of the turning points of my life. People didn't know me that well in the States because I was doing maybe a lot of local shows in New York and some TV, but not that well known. So Steve Allen flies me out there to LA, and it's nighttime. And he's standing at the other end of a stage because it was done in a theater setting, not a TV set. It's more of a theater setting. And he's standing on the dais, the way Letterman did and everybody else did. And he says, this young man is very gifted. You probably don't know about him. So I walk out, and in those days, 60s and 70s, the lights were very blinding in broadcasting. And the moving camera, as I'm walking, had lights all around the top and the sides, and they were blinding. And like I know it all, sure, I'm looking at the camera and I'm talking to Steve Allen, who I never met before, and saying how much I admire and so. As I'm getting closer to Steve Allen, I'm also experiencing a phenomenon called blindness, where I can't see. I go to turn to Steve Allen, trip over the dais, and fall flat on my face. My family considers it the highlight of my career. So there I'm on the floor, I'm kneeling down, and the audience chuckles, but Steve Allen wasn't the mocking type comedian. He said, "You're all right, young man, it's all right." And he was very kind to me. But a man was watching the show that night, and he saw the incident going across the stage falling. And 6 or 7 or 8 weeks later, Johnny Carson created Karnak, the Magnificent. Oh. Karnak falling over the table was me. So
it's great. I had no idea. That's so cool. The Mighty Karnak was based on you.
Let me tell you one more thing. I never intended the title Amazing. I'd be walking on airplanes, and people would be coming off and say, "Hi, Amazing," or I'd be coming off a plane in any part of the country or somewhere, and they'd say, "Hi, Amazing." I would say to my road manager, "That's really very flattering of them. It's nice that that's the way they think of my work and what have you." And then, because I didn't get to always see the nighttime shows early because I'd be working at night, I turned on the Carson show, and I'm going to be on next week, or let's say it's Friday, and he's going to talk about Monday. And Johnny turns to Ed McMahon, who worked with Johnny for years, and Carson says, "Ed, we're having on Monday Kreskin," and Ed McMahon says, "Oh, that's great." And Carson said, "Well, the last time he was on, it was only 90% amazing." And Ed McMahon said, "No, it was 92% amazing." It turns out, for all those years, they had that routine. That was a routine, so that's how I got the name. I didn't even know about it. And then one of the crews says, "Aren't you watching them?" I don't mean to offend anyone, but no, I don't always see the shows. So that's how it came about. I could go on for hours and tell you experiences from my career.
One of the experiences I'd love for you to recount was the time you appeared at the Johnny Carson show, and the routine you were planning on doing was, I think, NBC executives said they were opposed to what you're doing, right?
NBC banned me from doing it and called me and said, "You're not to do it with them." And Carson called me and told NBC off and said, "You're going to do it." Carson had technical language, which some of you may have heard about it. A lot of it deals with 4-letter words, and said what he thought of NBC. He said, "We're going to do it." And during the show, Bette Midler is a guest. I bring Johnny over on the set, and Ed McMahon and none of the crew knew I was going to do it because we didn't do a walkthrough. So Johnny stands there, and McMahon's there, and I said, "I'm going to count Johnny." His eyes closed. I said, "Ed, if Johnny starts to swaying backwards, you catch him." He says, "You're goddamn right, I'll catch him." He didn't know what he told him. Carson's going to fall over, So Johnny sways, and they catch him, and they lift him. And I said, between 2 chairs, put his head in shoulders here, his feet there, nothing under the middle of him. There was no trickery involved. And we asked Bette Midler to come over, and she wouldn't. And I asked her again in a very nice way, and she wouldn't. And Fred DeCordova, the producer, said, why don't you got to go over. You got to go over. And she finally came over. And I said, I want you to sit in the middle of him. And she looked like I was out of my mind. I said, please sit in the middle of him and lift your legs up. No support under him, no support in the middle. And she looked at her leg, and the audience was gasping. And they had a photographer. They didn't usually allow one, but they allowed one because I requested. The picture of that scene was in the centerfold of Parade magazine throughout the country a few days later. When we finished and lifted her off and slowly stood Carson, I counted backwards, and his eyes opened. He said, I would have thought a baby was sitting on him. I used the power of suggestion to heighten his muscular reaction. And this is the thing, as history showed it, that NBC banned, and Carson said, hell the ban. And then I do with Jimmy Fallon when we talk about it, except that when he was stretched between two chairs, the great musicians on the show had stretched him there, and he's a tall guy. No, I didn't have anyone sit on him. Gentlemen, let me grab another chair. I grabbed a chair, climbed on the chair, climbed off the chair, and stood on the middle of him. And that was the drama of the scene. So you can see how things happen unexpectedly.
Yeah.
Kreskin, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for taking so much time to talk with us.
And I'm not going to say goodbye, but I'm going to say this, and I mean this sincerely, because I've said it all over the world. In the spirit of broadcasting, let's just say, to be continued.
Dick Cavett,
Not everybody is aware of your lifelong interest in magic. So how did that start? When did you first get into magic?
It started at the Nebraska State Fair. I was wandering around, and there was a man with a crowd of people in front of him, and he was doing card tricks. He was doing them with a trick deck that all magicians know about called the Svengali deck. And it's a deck in which you can turn all the cards to the, let's say, Jack of Hearts, or all the cards to all the different cards in a deck. And before the eyes of the astounded onlookers. He did about 20 minutes of dazzling tricks with this thing. He did not reveal how it worked. You had to buy it to find that out. But it's a genius invention. I watched him probably for 2 hours do the same things over and over. And then I bought one, and I took it home, and I learned the routine of about 25, 30-minute routine that you can do with the deck. And I was astonishing people. And that was my beginning in magic. And I think some magician might be able to verify the fact that that man, I was then in junior high school, was named, I think, Jimmy Lobo. And he was known as the king of Svengalis. And he spent his life going from fairs and places and pitching the Svengali deck. That's how I got hooked on magic. The first magician I ever actually met was a man named Gene Gloy, who invented Watch Out. Magicians will know what I'm referring to. And the second magician I actually met was named Carson, Johnny Carson.
Oh, I've heard of him.
Yeah, he was. I was living in Lincoln, Nebraska then, and in Omaha was New York to people living in Lincoln. Big city. And Johnny had a successful radio show there. And he had been at the University of Nebraska, but I'd never met him then. He's about a dozen years older than myself, older than my parents' English teacher would say. And I got news that he was coming to Lincoln. So two friends of mine who also dabbled in magic got early to the basement of the church he was going to appear in and went downstairs where the theater in this church was. And we pulled back the curtain, and there was this man, magician, tall, good-looking man, arranging his tricks. And there's nothing a magician hates more than somebody coming around when he's putting the dove into the dove pan or putting something into something. And I said, "It's all right, Mr. Carson. We're magicians." We were probably in 10th grade. He said, "Well, come on back, fellas." And he was very nice to us, and he showed us some tricks at the table he was working at. And later that evening, as he was doing his really dazzling magic act for this crowd, church basement, he said, there are some fellows in the audience I'd like to introduce to you. They're magicians too. And he had us stand up, and the audience applauded. And we felt like we were on the Ed Sullivan Show. It just,
Wow.
at the end of that night, we watched Johnny glamorously disappear back into his probably 1938 DeSoto and head back for Omaha and the glamorous world of magic and radio in Omaha.
Wasn't there some issue with some outrage about what he was doing on stage? That he had like playing cards or something in a church? Am I misremembering that?
Oh, Lord. Yes, you must remember we were in the Bible Belt, and that wasn't obvious every day of your life. But on an occasion like this, some people were shocked and appalled and horrified because of the sin he committed that night. He used playing cards in a church. To imagine, has there ever been a greater crime in the history of the world? He did, of course, some card magic along with his other stuff.
It was a simpler time, wasn't it? I am sort of a closet magician. I've never taken any lessons. I just read books, and I do it for my own amusement. You went on and actually performed magic. Did you have a mentor? Did you find someone to, teach you, or how did you learn and grow?
Well, you've hit it on the head. I did have a mentor because I went to a theater in Lincoln one day, a movie theater, but this was Saturday morning, and they had a variety show. And then the first magician I ever saw, the aforementioned Gene Gloy, came out and did a dazzling act. And I got to know him, and he sort of took me under his wing and coached me in what to do and not to do and how to do things. And that was wonderful. And out of that, I got an act of my own. I charged $35 at one point. That was my highest pay. And I did about an hour of magic. In fact, getting $35 in those days was a fortune for me. I played lots of churches and Elks clubs and Lions clubs and ladies matinee events. And I made enough money that my school teacher parents were able to buy a new car.
Wow.
That made me popular with them.
You actually entered a contest and won when you were just a teenager, right?
Yeah. There are two organizations, the Society of American Magicians, or the SAM, and the IBM. And I went to the IBM, International Brotherhood of Magicians convention. I hadn't planned to perform there, but I had a rope and scissors and a few things I could use if I needed to. And I entered the Best New Performer contest, and I won it. The humor was that one of the other contestants was the president of the Society of American Magicians. This ended with an article in the Lincoln Journal called Young Lincoln Sharpie Best Magicians Group Head. Journalese, if you ever heard it. And 3 pictures of me doing my rope trick, which I beat the president of the Society of American Magicians and a few others. I got a trophy, and they introduced me at the big banquet that night as the winner, and in a room full of magicians, a ballroom of a hotel in St. Louis. But I stood up, but I still couldn't be seen in the crowd. So I got up and stood on the chair. This got an enormous hand and laugh, and there I was, soaking up applause for one of the first times in my life.
Not the last, boy.
By the way, on stage, I did my rope trick that night. I got a little girl on stage to be my helper, and I used what every magician knows, the breakaway wand. It's a magic wand, black with silver tips, and you hand it to the person, and when they take it, it sort of falls all to pieces and sags. So you take it back, and it straightens again, and you give it back to them, and it falls limp again. As I went into giving her the breakaway wand with magicians watching, I ad-libbed, "You're probably the only person out of the hundreds in this room who doesn't know what's about to happen." And the audience loved that because all the magicians had their own breakaway wand. That was great fun. then I saw in the paper that Blackstone, the great Harry Blackstone, the last of the great illusionists, was coming to Omaha, and I went there, and he played with a Ginny Simms movie, and then an hour of Blackstone's Great Illusion. And again, I was in hog heaven. Went backstage in my pushy young way and said hello to Blackstone.
Wow.
And got a photograph, and I left on top of the world. But I realized that I had left my dad's pen in there that he autographed the picture with. So I had to go back and find Blackstone and say, I think I left my dad's pen here. Blackstone, either magically or normally, I never knew which, said, but I put the pen in your pocket. And I reached in my pocket, and there it was.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if he did it by magic or what, but I loved it. And I felt kind of silly at that point. But I had met Stone, so there wasn't much farther to go. I went farther, of course. So if you have a kid who doesn't quite know what to do with himself or herself and can get them introduced in magic, you're golden. It will obsess them. They'll love it. They'll learn of the magic magazines that come out every month, a magic catalog. I have old magic catalogs that are just threadbare and falling apart from obsessing over them. And it's a great life to be a young magician. The other great move was I got to Chicago, where my cousin lived. And Chicago had 3 big-time magic shops. And I went to all of them, and I hung around in them, and I talked to magicians. And somebody said, you ought to come to the Round Table, kid. And they took me to a restaurant, which for some reason I remember was called the Drake. And there was a table with about 15 local, some well-known magicians. And again, I was in hog heaven.
Yeah.
When you were in Chicago and you were at the table with all the magicians, is that when you met Jay Marshall?
Oh, yes, yeah. Because one of the 3 magic shops in Chicago was Joe Berg, Percy Abbott, the Abbott Magic Shop, and Ireland's. Francis Ireland ran the Ireland Magic Shop. And as I got off the elevator on the 5th floor and saw the door that said Ireland's on it, as I opened it and walked in, a man about 5 steps up a stepladder I recognized. And I said, you're Jay Marshall. I saw you on Ed Sullivan. And Jay Marshall, a debonair, wonderful, marvelous, funny man, came down the 3 steps of the ladder behind the counter and kept going out of sight down below behind the counter. And then he pretended to be so flattered he couldn't bear it. And we became good friends, and he was a wonderful character.
Yeah. I had the good pleasure of talking to Sandy Marshall a couple of weeks ago about his dad. And he told exactly that story about when you came into the shop and that Jay pretended that there were steps going down to a basement that wasn't there. And he still laughed about it.
It was wonderful meeting him. And by the way, he invented a wonderful thing in magic. He could take a roll off the table from the plate of rolls and bounce it off the floor so that it came back up into his hand. A great contribution to the world of magic. And off the train, Chicago, and went to Ireland's and spent the night in Chicago and saw Jay and Francis Ireland, Jay Marshall and Francis Ireland for lunch. And I heard afterwards that Francis Ireland, who ran the shop, said to somebody, that kid really knows magic.
And you did, I bet you did.
Puffed up again. And then did the Don Allen television show.
You did?
Yep. It came from Chicago, and it was the early days of TV. We didn't even have television in Lincoln at that point, but I saw myself on the monitor doing my rabbit vanish trick and had the first experience afterwards, going back to Evanston where my cousin lived, of people on the street saying, saw you on television.
Wow.
You were great, kid.
Wow.
And again, I entered another hog heaven.
I had not remembered that you'd met Blackstone, and that's
And Don Allen, who I idolize.
yeah.
Yeah. I had him on my show in later years.
Don Allen?
And yeah, it was odd that world reversed, and I had done Al-Anon rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
But that was the beginning. There was no turning back at that point. I was destined to go on in magic and have great times with it.
What did you know that other TV people might not have known about the best way to present magic on TV when you had these legends on your show?
Well, luckily I knew what they wanted, what they needed, what they performed, what were not to put a camera, if you see what I mean. For example, it's something, a magician doing certain manipulations at a table like the great Slidini did on my show. You don't want to put a camera to one side of him. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah.
But I knew sort of things. So, because magicians had been screwed badly by inept appearances on television by people who didn't know magic and didn't know, as in this example, not to put a camera to the right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's video of at least one of Slidini's appearances on your show on YouTube. And I noticed that not only did you put the camera in the right place, but I don't believe there's hardly a cut ever, even to a reaction shot. It's just the camera's locked down, Slidini does his stuff, and it's as if you were sitting across the table from him.
Yeah, it was done live without any editing, which was just people would suspect. And people who saw him just said, I didn't know what magic could be until I saw Slidini, who with coins and cards and cigarette and things just performed miracles one after the other. And it was a great thing because he was a great success. I mean, he was known in the magic world as an idol and genius, but he hadn't ever been on television. He had been once in Italy, and he swore off television for life.
How did you then get him to be on your show?
Well, I met him by sheer accident. I was going to see Doug Henning's Evening of Magic on Broadway, and going backstage there in the dressing room was Slidini.
Wow.
And I chilled all over. And he said, you do Cavett? And I said, yeah. He said, maybe I'm going to do your show. And I brought me two, and as they say, then they brought me two more. And I said, would you? And he did this stunning appearance. And the next day, for the first time in his life, he said, I go to my store to buy a paper. They say, oh, Mr. Slidini, we saw you on the television. And it added another dimension to his already successful career. And I had him on several times after that. He just loved it. And he was just tremendously wonderful magician and a nice man who taught magic and shepherded kids into their introduction to card sleight of hand and coins and so on. So it was nice that I boosted the already successful career of Slidini by putting him on television.
That's incredible. I took a few classes from one of Slidini's students, Jim Cellini, who, God rest his soul, has passed away since, but to be in the room with Slidini or on television with Slidini must have been so amazing for you.
When I saw him in Doug Henning's dressing room backstage, it was like, to me then, what Woody Allen said the first time Sid Caesar walked into the room when he was a young man, got a job on the Sid Caesar show. He said, it's like seeing a god. And that's the way, it was that way when I saw Sid Caesar too. But that's how it felt when I saw there is Slidini. We're in the same room. There's nothing but air between us. Wow. By the way, I see you have involved with Steve Cohen.
Yeah, we chatted with him a couple weeks ago, and we both have had the pleasure of seeing his show back when it was at the Waldorf before it moved.
Did he do the kettle, the magic?
Yes.
Like just an old sweet kettle.
Yes.
That poured drink called for?
Any drink.
It's one of those tricks I don't want to know how it's done. It's
Exactly.
so amazing.
Really.
Me too, because it is a fact when people say, oh my God, I'd give anything if I could know how you did that. And you learn quickly not to tell them, not to be mean, but because the only reaction you get, oh, is that all it is?
Yep.
Oh, Eddie Murphy offered me $10,000 to show him how I did a certain trick. And I couldn't take it. I just couldn't. It was a floating dollar bill.
So you had it sounds like the pleasure of having a lot of your heroes in magic on the show. One that jumped out for me right away was that you got to see Ricky Jay early on.
This is odd timing. I thought of Ricky Jay yesterday and got sad all over again. Ricky Jay was a young man who mastered sleight of hand magic. I saw his Woody Allen, and I went to see him on the show in New York one night. And afterwards, he said, "Let's go to a restaurant. And do you know one near here?" And somebody said, "Yeah, why not this one?" We went in there. About 8 of us, other young magicians, were eating, and suddenly one of the waiters came over. And he said, "You're magicians. I wonder if you'd be interested in this. It's an antique deck of cards." And he had this valuable antique deck with different designs. And I don't know if it had the 4 suits or 5 or 6 suits, really an old collector's item. And Ricky took it and he said, "This is a wonderful thing. Do you mind if I just shuffle it and play around, do a couple sleights with it?" He had someone at the table select a card from the antique deck, took it, and surprisingly threw it at a bottle that was sitting on the table. When they picked up the cards that had scattered all around when the deck hit the bottle, the chosen card was inside the bottle.
Oh, my goodness.
I've never known how it. Somebody else I know went with him once out in the country, and they got lost, and they didn't get to the place they were supposed to go to, but they went to a restaurant nobody knew, sat at a table, ate. Somebody pointed out that somebody's derby had been sitting on the table all this time, and Ricky Jay said, "Is that your hat?" The guy, "Yeah." So, "Do you mind if I touch it?" No. Ricky picked up the derby sitting there, and under it was a 5-pound block of ice. Figure it out.
A la Max Malini. That's fantastic.
It's Max Malini come to life.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Did you? I'm going to just skip back to something because I'm curious about it. After you met Mr. Carson, and then he, of course, went on to the Tonight Show, and you had your show. Did you two maintain a friendship? Did you talk magic?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Johnny was one of the most sort of incompetently social people I've ever known. He was so uncomfortable with strangers. He had a hard time with them. In fact, when I worked for him, I would sometimes make a point of going out and after the taping and the audience was coming out. And if anybody saw Carson and rushed over to talk to him, I went over and helped him get rid of them nicely because he was so miserable having to talk to people like that. And people would say, "You're crazy. He talks to people all the time on his show." Yeah, that's easy, but in real life, hard for him. He liked me seemingly more than was likely with him. And one night, the year he died, we went together to a restaurant in Los Angeles, and we talked for maybe 2.5 hours about magic and other things.
His love of magic really came across when he had magicians on his show. He was it seemed like he was a really good audience for a good magician. Do you think was his secret? He was just a good audience?
Well, he really, really loved magic. It was a real part of his life. And yes, he loved every magician he had on and reacted perfectly to them and knew things to ad lib that contributed to the success of the appearance, and magicians loved going on with him. But he really was a terrific performer of magic. Shame he didn't do it more publicly. He did the floating cane once on a television show, where a cane floats in the air in front of you and goes around you and up and down in the air. And people were stunned by that, as they would be, as you would in life if a cane did that. He really liked it. He loved it. He had a lot of magic books in his apartment. It was a valuable part of his young life. He was socially awkward, and that's what magic does for some kids. It gives them a life suddenly that they didn't have before. And people saying, "God, how do you do that?" You can see a young kid, the first time that happens, glow with pleasure.
Now, back when you were writing for Carson, are there any magicians that appeared on his show while you were there that you were particularly thrilled to see and to meet?
Di Vernon, the king of the magic world, a magician named Di, D-A-I. Vernon was really the grand old master of the magic world. In his later years, he lived right next to the magic castle, so he would be there every night. And I went there one night with Johnny after the show. Johnny said, "You going anywhere, Richard?" And I said, "No, of course." He said, "You want to go to the castle?" So we did. And Vernon was there, as he almost always was. He was really the dean of the magic world. We sat at a table, and Vernon recalled great stories of the great magicians that he had known. One of them was the only magician many people can name in history, Houdini. Isn't it remarkable that Houdini is still known to people? Nobody ever says, "Who's that?" hardly. Even younger people know about him. Anyway, we're sitting there, and I said, "How was Houdini likable?" And Vernon said, "No." Carson and I laughed. I said, "Well, give me an example." And he said, "One night I was backstage after Harry Houdini's show, and we were chatting, and his valet or whatever brought in the shirt for his second show that night. And the shirt was not folded the way Harry liked it, and he smacked the man across the face with the back of his hand."
Wow.
And then the poor guy left. And Vernon said to Houdini, "Harry, you can't treat people like that." And he said, "I am Houdini." What a schmuck.
If my notes are correct, you went on to have Di Vernon on your show.
I did, yes. On the same show, I had Doug Henning.
Yeah.
And Vernon did his, as magicians know the phrase, cards to pocket routine. And linking rings, where solid steel rings are examined, and then they begin to link to each other, and bang one ring against the other, and suddenly it's part of it. It's linked to it, and people just faint at the genius of a great linking ring routine. Even a bad magician can astonish with the linking rings if he doesn't drop them or anything. But Burton was wonderful.
Jumping back, you mentioned a special, and again, in my notes, it looks like you hosted at least one magic special.
Yeah, from the Ed Sullivan Theater in New York. And Ricky Jay was on the first one and threw cards, it sounds silly, threw cards into a watermelon.
Yeah.
It was 12 feet away from him, and he could throw a card with force and a certain grip so that it sliced into the watermelon and stuck there. Not a trick, just a genius talent he had for doing almost anything with any object.
You had brought up Teller of Penn and Teller. They were on your show, I know, early in their careers. What, in your opinion, what set them apart, or why did you want them on your show?
Well, I had seen their show in New York. Penn and Teller did Broadway a couple times, and I just thought, I got to know these guys. So in my pushy way, I went backstage and introduced myself, and we became really good friends. And they're wonderful because they've really been an asset to the world of magic. Teller came to my house in the country for a weekend once, and we were standing around in the kitchen, and you hate to ask a magician do some tricks, so that's not part of the decorum of magic. But Teller, knowing that I wanted to see something unusual, said okay. And we were in the kitchen, and he said, "Do you have a sharp knife?" And I said, "Yeah, I got one out of the drawer." And he poked his finger, it pointed at the end of the fingertip with the knife, causing blood to come out. And it came out in a sort of solid bubble of blood at the end of his finger. And I thought, well, this isn't anything I've ever heard of in magic. And he said, "You have to be observant about things." And he directed our attention to the bubble of blood that was there all the time, never went out of sight on his fingertip. But suddenly, poking it with the knife, it was a live ladybug which flew away.
Oh my goodness.
I don't want to know how he did that.
No.
I could not believe my eyes, a phrase that comes up often in the world of magic. So Teller has one on me. I think he would tell me, but I sort of enjoy not knowing. You know what I mean? It's nice to not know one thing in magic.
Can we talk a little bit about Orson Welles? I know he was on your show. I don't know if he ever did magic on your show, though.
You know, I can't remember for sure either. I don't think he did. I wish I had asked him to. I think he would have liked to do it. But he was an excellent magician. He did a full evening show of magic when he was in his years in Hollywood. He would vanish Marlene Dietrich and that sort of thing. Not every magician gets to do that.
No.
Younger folks will have to have a footnote of who Marlene Dietrich was. But yeah, he was really good. He did large illusions. But yeah, he was really, really good. It wasn't just that he liked magic. He really, really was good.
Did he talk a little bit at all about debunking seances with Houdini?
It seems like he may have. Seance is something I always wanted to go to, where a trance medium, for example, would contact the dead for an audience of believers. And Groucho in vaudeville, that a woman came back on stage one night and she said, Groucho, you don't know me, but I wondered, I'd like to give you an invitation. One of the great trance mediums, her name was Anna Eva Faye. She was legendary. She contacted the dead. She was dramatic. He said she looked like Margaret Dumont in their movies, the Dowager Lady. Groucho erased his mustache in those days, and so he was never recognizable without it. So he went to this place, and they said, you'll have to be, I hate to have to say this to you, Groucho, but you'll have to be on your good behavior. Be reverent. They said, oh, for Christ's sake, I know I'm an idiot on stage, but I can be serious, and I'm interested in supernatural. In front of this audience of believers, the great Anna Eva Faye stood there and at one point said, I am now in touch with the other side. Does anyone have a question? And from this worshiping audience, a voice said, what is the capital of North Dakota? Groucho said he escaped. He just escaped with his life.
Can we talk about Groucho for a minute? As long as we're talking about Groucho, can we talk about Groucho for a minute? I know it's not completely down our alley, John, of magic, but here's somebody who was a good friend of one of our mutual idols, Groucho Marx. Give us your favorite story about Groucho.
Well, I really got to know Groucho, and he really was a friend, and we exchanged letters and went to his house and hung out with him. And I had to constantly pinch myself. But Groucho does have a connection with magic. He went to see Houdini one night, who was one of the biggest stars in the world at that point. And Houdini unwittingly called Groucho and a couple other strange people now. It's up on the stage. And then he came to his famous trick where he allegedly swallowed a handful of needles, about a dozen needles, put in his mouth. They vanished from his mouth. Then he put a long string of thread in his mouth, swallowed that, and then worked one end of the thread out of his mouth, pulled on it, and out came 2 or 3 inches apart all the needles threaded on the thread. But before he did the great trick, he said, I want to know that this trick involves my mouth. And in order to do it, my mouth has to be totally empty. So I would like one of you people to look in my mouth and see if you see anything. And he opened his mouth, not knowing who he had opened it to. And Groucho said, when Houdini said, what do you see in my mouth? Groucho said, pyorrhea. I don't think Houdini ever quite recovered from that.
But not. I bet he didn't think that was funny.
That'll teach you to Groucho Marx up on stage.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. Do you still get a chance to play around with magic now? I mean, do you still take out a deck of cards and do some tricks, or just for yourself, for your wife, or friends?
I got brought back again to it suddenly one night by Teller, who took me to dinner in a New York restaurant, and he had invited several young magicians that he knew, and we had a wonderful time at the table as they all did their specialties, and that was great. It's a wonderful, wonderful hobby, even if you don't go any farther than being a hobby.
All right. This has been so much fun. We could talk to you for hours about this. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your experiences with magic.
An honor and a privilege, sir. Honestly, so great to spend a few minutes with you. Just
you'll wonder why I brought Jack Parr up at this point. But he told a story. One of the great roundtable wits, I think it was George Kaufman, and they were at some people's house, and after dinner, they had a little girl play the piano, and she played it, and then she played some more. She was probably 9 years old, and then she played it some more. And Kaufman said, "Darling, you're wonderful, but I think you have delighted us enough." I'm wondering if I've delighted you enough.
Not at all. I could be here all day chatting.
We could. Thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Anytime.
Oh, don't say that. We'll
Thank
call
you
back
for
in
handling-
5 minutes if you say that.
Nicholas Meyer.
Do you remember what it was that caused your dad to write that book?
I know something about it. I should throw in a couple of helpful, I don't know if they're helpful, additions. He was interested, the subjects that kind of absorbed his attention, not all of them, but a preponderant degree, were the sons of passive or absent fathers. This was a topic which probably originated from his experiences with his own father, my grandfather, who was a very interesting man and a kind of a world beater, but who spent so much of his time doing what they said in The Wizard of Oz, being a Philip, good deed doer, that he didn't have enough time for fathering. He was not a bad man at all, quite a conscientious one, but the parenting was left to his wife. And I think my father missed and was affected by not having an involved father. For me, he was an extremely involved father. So he only wrote 2 full-length books, my dad. He wrote a lot of short papers and monographs. He was interested in men like Saint-Exupéry or Bishop Pike or Joseph Conrad, which was his other full-length biography, who didn't have fathers or who didn't have involved fathers, present fathers, and so forth. And I think that a colleague of my dad's said to him, "Houdini, that's the guy for you." And that's how he did it. I'm only sorry that he didn't live to see the 2-night television series based on his book.
Yeah, I enjoyed it immensely as a kind of Houdini fan. It was fascinating and fun, and Adrian Brody is terrific, as is the woman who plays Bess. I thought I knew a lot about Houdini, and there was a lot in there that I did not know. And I really enjoyed the opening to it, which suggests that it's all fact and all fiction, and it's our job to figure out which is which
Well,
I thought was brilliant.
That's magic for you.
Yeah, right.
Which
Yeah.
is, it's odd that we're talking about magic, more odd than you know, because 2 nights ago, I was a guest at the Magic Castle
No.
in Los Angeles, and I hadn't been there in several years, and I was privileged to witness some astonishing feats of magic and manual dexterity, and I'm a sucker for all that. So I looked at it, I was like, how do they do that? And my girlfriend kept saying, how do they do that? How do they do that? And the answer always came back, very well.
Yeah, very well. Wonders never cease, as Houdini was fond of saying in your television show. So your dad had really no interest in magic before embarking on this long book about Houdini?
My father was a rather cultivated guy whose interests were Catholic. He was interested in all kinds of things. He was interested in literature. He was interested in music. He was a music fool. He was a terrific pianist and a great sight reader. He put any piece of music in front of him and he'd read it right off. He was married to a concert pianist. He loved the ballet, the opera. And whether you're talking about Shakespeare or James Bond, he gobbled all that stuff up in the same way it seems that I do. And so magic was just another, part of it, in the same way I suppose that when you look at the career of somebody like Orson Welles, they're interested in magic. Every boy at a certain point sort of plays with a magic kit, and some people pursue it and pursue it, pursue it. And some people, let it go along with their first chemistry set. So yes, I think it was not his exclusive or predominant interest. No.
Were you interested in magic as a kid at all?
I think I've always been a great audience, and it didn't matter what I was an audience for. You could take me to the circus, you could take me to the Marx Brothers, you could take me to the opera, you could take me to a magic show, and I simply gobbled all that stuff up. You could put me in front of an episode of The Lone Ranger or Sergeant Bilko. I didn't care. I'm just a great audience. But I don't think magic, I would be beguiled. I would be amazed as I was 2 nights ago. And then I kind of go on to other stuff.
Well, you've gone on to a lot of great stuff. I love your Sherlock Holmes books. I certainly am a big fan of the work you did in the Star Trek series, which when we talk of Venn diagrams, that would absolutely be part of my circle. How'd you come to being involved with the TV miniseries about your dad's book?
I have been friends and worked for many years with a television producer named Jerry Abrams. I started working with Jerry in 1973 with the first teleplay that I wrote was for a television movie called Judge Dee and the Haunted Monastery. I seem to be incapable of explaining things shortly. Everything is a big digression, and I'm very sorry for your listening.
No, it's fantastic.
You can always shut it off. Anyway, the point is that there was China apparently invented everything first, including detective stories. And a circuit court judge in the 7th century, Judge D. Gen-J, solved mysteries. And people wrote detective stories about him, and now there are movies about him. But back in 1972 or something like that, and I had just come to Hollywood and was looking for work and didn't know anybody. And I met Jerry Abrams, and I met a director named Jeremy Kagan. And I'm happy to say both of these gentlemen are alive and still my friends. It gave me a shot to write this Judge Dee and the Haunted Monastery because I think ABC thought they were going to get a kung fu movie out of it, which it wasn't. But it was a television movie with an all-Asian cast. The monastery in question was the old Camelot Castle on the Warner Brothers lot. And that's where I met Jerry. And Jerry and I have been friends ever since. Jerry's son is J.J. Abrams, who directs movies. Anyway, Jerry said to me a couple of years ago, let's do Houdini. And I said, oh, funny, you should say that because my dad wrote a very interesting book about Houdini. I would be interested if it were based on his book. I would only be interested. And that's how it got made.
What was your process for, did you know it was 2 nights going in? Did you know it was going to be that long? How did you get started on it? What other resources did you use? Because I know there's stuff mentioned in the movie that I don't remember being in your dad's books. You must have had to dig a little bit.
There's a lot of books about Houdini that I read, many books, because my dad's book is distinguished, if one could call it that, by being the only book of all the books about Houdini that attempts some inner explanation of his psychological process, the why. Why would you do this? Why do you feel the need to do this? Other books will tell you what Houdini did, and some will tell you how he did it. But my dad's book, as I say, it kind of explores the why of it. And so I read these other books to supplement the rest of the how and the what. And I've amassed quite a large Houdini library. When I say large, probably compared to yours, not so much, but I must have like 10 books about Houdini and flying airplanes and Houdini and Arthur Conan Doyle and spiritualism and so forth. So yes, I read all those to supplement what I was trying to condense. I don't remember whether at this point, whether it was proposed as 2 nights or 3 nights or whatever. I also know that if it hadn't been for Adrian Brody agreeing to play Houdini, it never would have happened. They weren't going to do it without a star.
He's great. So
Nothing
so
happens
plays
without a star.
Bess. Yeah.
I was telling Jim earlier before you got on that my wife was kind enough to sit down and watch it with me. She's always worried in things like this that she's going to see how something's done. She doesn't want to know how magic is done at all. And when we got to the end, she said, Houdini seems so nice. He's such a likable guy. And I said, I think that's really more Adrian Brody.
Oh, it is. It's definitely Adrian Brody. As I say, the movie would not have got made without Adrian. I'm not sure that he wasn't to a large degree cast against type.
Mm-hmm.
I think Houdini was a guy with ants in his pants, a kind of frenetic character. And I don't think when you read about him in any detail that he was what you'd call nice. I think he was a person who had a lot of charm that he could switch on and off like a tap. And I think, and this is one of the things that my dad's book brings out, and we tried to bring it out in the movie, that whose own father was a failure, a flop, an absent parent. He was a Hungarian rabbi who moved to Appleton, Wisconsin, but in umpteen years never managed to learn to speak English, got fired by his congregation, wound up in New York working in a necktie factory with his son. So I think Houdini spent a lot of his life looking for substitutes or alternative father figures. And I think the first one he probably stumbled on was the French magician Robert Houdin, from whom he took his name. And I think Houdini's pattern, at least according to my dad's reading of it, was to find father figures and fall hard for them, only to ultimately become disenchanted and alienated and furious with them, probably because ultimately they weren't his real father. But I think there was something like that going on.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that that's what happened with Doyle as well.
Yes, but he had better reason than in some other cases to be disenchanted with Doyle, because Doyle's Atlantic City seance with Lady Doyle, Houdini ultimately regarded as a real betrayal, because he decided, probably correctly, that the contact with his mother via Lady Doyle doing spirit writing was fake. And by the way, it's not that Mrs. Doyle or Lady Doyle might not have believed what she was doing. It just didn't track for two reasons, as your listeners may already know. Houdini experienced this contact with his mother, and he was as obsessed with her as he was with the fact of an absent father. And he was so overcome when she spoke to him via the spirit writing that it was a couple of days before he realized that his mother didn't speak a word of English, and she had communicated via Lady Doyle in English. She only spoke Yiddish. Doyle got around this difficulty by explaining that the medium, in this case Lady Doyle, worked as a kind of simultaneous translator. And Houdini said, yeah, but, and this was the second item, it was his birthday, and she never mentioned it. And she always sent him something on his birthday, and he then denounced Doyle and Lady Doyle as, quote, menaces to mankind.
Oh boy.
End quote.
Wow.
That'll get you right off the Christmas card list.
Exactly. In Lady Doyle's defense, I quote George Costanza, "It's not a lie if you believe it."
Absolutely. So were you involved in a day-to-day way with production? And I'm wondering why you didn't direct it.
I was involved. The whole movie was shot in Budapest. Everything. Wisconsin, Missouri, was all. And I was involved. I was not invited to direct. I have not directed really since the death of my wife in 1993. I had two small children to raise. And by the time it was like possible for me to go back, since they are now grown up and busy, I was sort of out of the game.
Oh, that's too bad. You're a terrific director.
I'm not arguing with you.
So as you were scripting it and you were using other sources, Jim and I were discussing earlier about how there was sort of a whitewashing of Houdini early on, and then more and more stuff came out and other books came out and he became more and more human, I guess. How concerned were you about this is fact, this is fiction?
That's a very good question. And it doesn't just apply to Houdini. It applies largely to the whole issue of dramatizing the stories taken based on real events. And by the way, you could make the case in a way that there's no such thing as fiction, that all fiction ultimately can be traced back to something real. I'll give you two examples off the top of my head. One, Moby Dick was based on a real whale called Mocha Dick because of his color. And as Heinrich Schliemann proved when he discovered Troy, most legends, most myths have their origins somewhere in the mists of time in some kind of reality. It turns out there was a place called Troy. So he was not far sort of off the mark. It's a knotty question with a K, how much we owe to fact and how much we get to mush around and dramatize. And the answer has to be inevitably elastic. The part that's the problem is that people are neither taught nor do they read history anymore. We are not taught civics. We are not taught history. Nobody knows anything. And so by default, movies and television are where we get our history. And that history is not always truthful. It is dramatized. For example, in that Academy Award winning movie, The Deer Hunter, we learn that the North Vietnamese made American prisoners of war in Vietnam play Russian roulette. There's no evidence, no historical evidence that they ever did any such thing. And yet, if you're getting your history from the movies, that's what you see. And someone said that seeing is believing. I think magicians depend on this. In any case, you have to sort of always be looking over your own shoulder when you are dramatizing history and realizing that, yes, you can telescope dates and characters, but what's the point where you cross a line and start inventing things out of whole cloth? Is it justified to show the North Vietnamese forcing American boys to play Russian roulette? I'll give you another example. Was Richard III really the monster that Shakespeare portrays? Now remember, Shakespeare is writing for the granddaughter of the man who killed Richard III and usurped his throne and calls himself king. You could make a very different case that that guy was a scumbag and that Richard was not. Yeah. But, you know, Shakespeare was in business. The Globe Theater was a money-making operation, and Henry VII's granddaughter was the Queen of England. So there are a lot of variables here when you sit down to dramatize. I've worked for the History Channel, one was Houdini, and I can tell you the History Channel will not make a movie where Americans look bad.
Really?
History Channel will not make a movie that questions at any point in our own history our right to the moral high ground. It's a point of view and they have a demographic. Yeah. And Americans don't want to be shown any of their own flaws or asked to think about them.
Well, who does? Can I ask questions about the espionage part of what I witnessed last night? Although I had a sort of a vague memory that there is some espionage connection or perhaps connection.
Perhaps.
Perhaps. It was very clear in the first episode that he was working for at least the American government and perhaps the English government as well. Is there evidence for that?
Circumstantial evidence, yes.
And I suppose that it could still be, even at this late date, protected in some way in terms of, I don't know, them not admitting or maybe no real hard evidence exists anymore, right?
I'm more inclined to think that no real hard evidence exists, although we all know that, you know, somebody said truth is the daughter of time, but a lot of evidence has, for a lot of things, not merely in this country, but also England, has been redacted and eliminated and buried. You know, how many of your listeners know the story of Alan Turing? Alan Turing may have shortened World War II by as much as 2 years by inventing the computer that, you know, helped break the German Enigma code. Alan Turing signed the Official Secrets Act, which meant that his wartime work could never be revealed. Alan Turing was gay. After the war was over, Alan Turing was arrested on a morals and indecency charge, and he could not tell the world who he was. And so he was sentenced to some kind of chemical castration, I believe.
That's right.
And he killed himself. And all of this remained a secret for the next 55 years before the world's, you know, learned. And suddenly there was a play called Breaking the Code. And then there was the Enigma novel by Robert Harris. And then there was the movie, which is very inaccurate and very troublesome to me, The Imitation Game. Because in The Imitation Game, the first thing he does when he's arrested is tell the cop who he is. And the cop believes him. Where the crushing irony, as well as inaccuracy, is that there's no way he was allowed to tell. That was the price you pay when you sign the Official Secrets Act. So that movie kind of bugged me. Whereas, for example, Enigma, which I think is one of my favorite movies, doesn't bug me at all because it doesn't call him Alan Turing, and therefore he's not gay, and it's a different story entirely, spun out of, inspired by, but not pretending to be Alan Turing.
Well, now I'm going to have to watch that movie because I don't think I've seen it.
You never saw Enigma?
I don't believe I saw Enigma. Of course.
It's the only movie produced by Mick Jagger and Lorne Michaels, written by Tom Stoppard, Kate Winslet, Dougray Scott, Jeremy Northam. Anyway, it's a fantastic movie, but you have to watch it like 5 times in order to understand everything that's going on, because Tom Stoppard is not going to make it easy.
Is just a quick sidelight here. I remember reading somewhere that Mick Jagger was a possible first choice for Time After Time.
Yeah, Jack the Ripper.
Okay, interesting. I prefer the choice you came up with, but that's...
Well, when Warner Brothers, who was trying to sort of figure out how to make this movie, quote, commercial, they were so surprised when it was a hit. They suggested Mick Jagger as Jack the Ripper, and he was in LA at the time touring. And I really didn't understand the politics of not just filmmaking, but, you know, sort of office politics generally. And my first reply was no. You know, you might believe him as the Ripper, but you'd never believe him, or I didn't think you would believe him, as a Harley Street surgeon. And they said, you mean you won't even meet him? And that's when I said, oh, okay, I get it. I have to agree to meet, you know, so I met him. And then I said, fellas, I still don't, you know, think this can work. And so we went on to David Warner.
I think that was the first film I became aware of David Warner. And of course, it colored my opinion of David Warner for everything I've seen him in since, including him as Bob Cratchit in a version of A Christmas Carol. I kept thinking to myself, don't turn your back on him. He's a killer. He's a stone cold killer because of Time After Time, which is still one of my favorite movies.
Oh, thank you so much.
We promise not to geek out too much, but I have to tell you that the hotel room scene between him and Ann McDowell, I still pull up once or twice here to look at. The writing and the acting in that scene, you are literally the last person on earth I expected to see. They're both so good in that scene.
They are.
Yeah, but we promise not to go down that geeky route because we'd be here all day. Let's segue over to Sherlock Holmes, because that's an interest of mine and Jim's. And if it isn't an interest of our audience, they can just shut off right now. And I don't want them part of this podcast because it should be.
Have you guys read The Return of the Pharaoh?
I have read The Return of the Pharaoh. Jim's trying to get caught up because he's one book behind.
Right.
So you've read The Adventure of the Protocols.
That's what I'm reading right now. And
you are way behind. You're one into Houdini, and you're halfway through the Protocols, What do you do the rest of the time when you're not totally absorbed in my
Well,
work?
Yes, St. Paul is a very quiet, bucolic kind of place, and
Lots of time.
yeah, you're right. I have no excuse.
You have no
at all.
excuse. All
No,
right.
no excuse at all. I will say I've seen Wrath of Khan hundreds of times, if that counts for
No,
anything.
that's too late. I had a favorite niece of mine, who lives in Minneapolis, and when I was touring for the Adventure of the Peculiar Protocols, I spoke to the Norwegian Explorers of Minneapolis, which is the local Sherlock Holmes society. And I brought Amanda with me to the dinner. That was a lot of fun.
There's a lot of Sherlock Holmes interest in the Twin Cities. Larry Millett, who works out of St. Paul, has written a number of pastiches, not unlike yours, but in his case, putting Sherlock Holmes in the Twin Cities. I will admit to my own pastiche, which is called The Greyhound of the Baskervilles, which
Nice.
is exactly Conan Doyle's book, literally word for word, but just written from the point of view of his pet greyhound, Septimus. But in doing that project and rewriting what I think is his best novel, and then reading your stuff, I kind of prefer your stuff, with the exception of Hound of the Baskervilles. When it comes to the other Holmes novels, I don't really like them as much because they don't have the same pace and interest and fun stuff the short stories have. But you've absolutely captured that voice, and you feel more accurate to Doyle, to me, sometimes than Doyle does.
Well, for the benefit of your listeners, there are 60 Sherlock Holmes stories written by Arthur Conan Doyle. 56 of them are short stories, and 4 of them are novellas, of which, as you say, The Hound of the Baskervilles may be the best. If we discuss the other ones, A Study in Scarlet, which is the first Sherlock Holmes story that Doyle wrote, he was really feeling his way toward immortality. And by the way, Sherlock Holmes was not what he wanted to be remembered for. But he was a doctor. He was waiting for patients to knock on the door. Nobody was showing up. So he started writing stories and submitting them to magazines to make money. And A Study in Scarlet, which was published in 1887, was his first Sherlock Holmes story. And it is, for lack of a better term, a kind of a lumpy creation in which the two halves of the story are, they don't really seem to be related. And if, like me, you're 10 years old when you first read this story, or 11, and you're in London and you're trying to solve a murder, and the next you turn the page and you're in Utah and nobody has the same name and there is no Sherlock Holmes. And as a kid, I thought, oh, the printer has glued the wrong 2 books together. This is and then because I'm too lazy to get out of the chair, I just keep reading, right? And then you find, and then it all kind of comes together. The second story, The Sign of the Four, or The Sign of Four, when it was published in England, they took out the, which was written under very interesting circumstances. I don't know if your listeners know or care, but on the off chance,
I care.
the reason there's a second Sherlock Holmes story at all is due to the Americans. The American editor of Lippincott's magazine came to London and took 2 writers to dinner at the same time and commissioned additional novels from each. The first writer was Arthur Conan Doyle, young Dr. Doyle. He wanted another Sherlock Holmes story. The second writer at the dinner was Oscar Wilde.
Wow.
This was I wonder what they ordered. And so Doyle wrote The Sign of the Four, and Wilde wrote his notorious gay novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And it was very evident from The Sign of the Four that Doyle, who must have been simply awestruck by sitting at a dinner with Oscar Wilde, who was at that time the most famous English writer, even though he was Irish, and had written all these plays that were running, and is famous for his wit and his sort of flamboyant gay personality, even though he couldn't acknowledge it because it was against the law. But when Doyle wrote the character of Bartholomew and Thaddeus Sholto, they were clearly modeled on Oscar Wilde. So that dinner made a deep impression. The other thing that The Sign of the Four did for me personally was to get me interested in the Indian Mutiny of 1857, which is more or less where the book sort of opens. And I had never heard of the Indian Mutiny. Again, I'm 12 years old, never heard of anything. But it was what he was describing was so horrific that I became lifelong fascinated with India and its whole subject. And eventually I got to direct The Deceivers for Merchant Ivory with Pierce Brosnan. So The Sign of the Four, I think, is a pretty successful novella, and it's got a high-speed motorboat chase down the Thames. It's got savages with blowguns. It's got a lot of cool stuff. The third novella, The Valley of Fear, is an entirely true story, and that has to do with a vigilante pre-Union group of coal miners in the Pennsylvania coal fields in 1875 who were called themselves the Molly Maguires. In the novel, they're called the Scourers. But there is a great movie called The Molly Maguires with Sean Connery and Richard Harris and Frank Finlay, Samantha Eggar, written by Walter Bernstein, who just died age 100 and I don't know what, and directed by Martin Ritt, who directed HUD and Norma Ray. It was the last movie photographed by the great Chinese-American cameraman, James Wong Howe. And it's the whole story of the Valley of Fear, in which the Molly Maguires are called the Scourers. And then, of course, there's the Hound of the Baskerville. But Doyle never really managed, with the exception of the Hound of the Baskerville, to write a full-length Holmes adventure. They were always in flashback parts. Whereas I think that my 5 or 6 Holmes novels are always full-length stories. So yay for me.
I'm just taking notes here. Now I've got Enigma and the Molly Maguires on my list of things to see, which have somehow escaped my notice until this moment. But
I think the Molly Maguires is one of Sean Connery's greatest performances, and also Richard Harris.
High praise for both of them.
Yeah, that the Ritt Bernstein pairing they put together a lot of great movies. Those two guys together.
Yes, they did, and also the Ravages.
And The Front.
Oh, The Front.
Which is terrific. Getting back to Holmes, I think you mentioned in your memoir in passing that when you did 7% Solution, there was some back and forth with the Doyle estate. Jim and I have a friend, Jeff Hatcher, who wrote the screenplay for Mr. Holmes, which was based on a book, which once the movie came out, did run into some issues with the Doyle estate because the writer had taken some characteristics of Holmes from later books, which weren't.
It's all bullshit. All that is bullshit. The Doyle estate, which was once the richest literary estate in the world, was run into the ground by his descendants and their in-laws. And they don't care anything about Sherlock Holmes. All they care about is money. And what they try to do is to stick up movie companies and book companies and say, you've got to pay. And back when Holmes legitimately fell into copyright, which is when I wrote the 7% Solution, yes, I had to pay, and I understood that. I mean, I didn't understand it when I wrote the book because I was a kid, but I understood it when it was explained to me. What since happened is they continue, even though he's out of copyright, to try to pretend that he is, or that 1 or 2 stories are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My friend, Les Klinger, who is a business manager, but also happens to be a lawyer and a Holmes enthusiast, took the estate to court and won. He broke that bullshit stranglehold that they were trying to exercise on anybody who wanted to write or create or make a movie about Holmes. Now, it's also true that big companies like Warner Brothers or Paramount or something, if they make a Sherlock Holmes movie and the Doyle estate come sniveling to their door find it cheaper to say, here's $10,000, go away, than it is to bother to do what Les did, which was take him to court. It's blackmail. You've all seen The Godfather, give me a little something to wet my beak, is what this is all about. I have nothing good to say about them. And what they did with Mr. Holmes, your friend's movie, was they waited until the movie was about to come out before they hit him.
Yeah. Jim, I should mention, you probably don't know this, that, and this is the truth, the man we're talking to is the man for whom the thing at the beginning of a DVD that says the opinions expressed here are not those of this company, he's the reason that's on DVDs.
Is that right?
Yes, I will explain, because I'm very proud of it. I've made a couple of contributions to civilization. One of them is the movie The Day After. It's my nuclear war movie. And the other is this little sign. And it happened when they were preparing the DVD release of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And I was interviewed and asked to explain my contributions to making the movie, the script, the directing, etc. So I told the story about how I came to write the script. And the DVD lady, who subsequently became a very good friend of mine, said, gee, the lawyers say we can't use any of what you told us. And I said, and why is that? And they said Paramount was worried about getting in trouble with the Writers Guild because you were not credited as the author and you wrote this sort of under the table, the script. And I said, well, why don't you just take me out of the whole DVD? Because if I can't tell the truth about it, I don't want to be in it. And she said, that's what I hoped you would say. Now I've got some ammo. So she went back and she came back and she said, okay, here's the deal. And the deal now applies to every studio. The opinions expressed in this interview are not those of Paramount Pictures, its employees or affiliates, whatever. What this does is it stops those interviews from being bullshit puff pieces and allows them to become oral histories. Now, different people may have different oral histories of the same thing. You put them all on the DVD, but suddenly you've opened up a whole world to telling things that really happened or that the tellers think really happened or are their opinions, without the studio worried that they're going to be sued because of that little disclaimer. And they all have that now. And that's my contribution.
Well, that's great. Now, I promised John before this interview that I would not talk Star Trek with you, but since you've opened the door a little bit here, now that you say that you wrote Wrath of Khan under the table, can you just flesh that out for me? It might not ever be in the podcast, but I'm an incredible Star Trek fan, so I'm interested in this story.
Well, very quickly, I knew nothing about Star Trek when I met Harv Bennett, the producer of what was going to be the second Star Trek movie. And he showed me the first movie. He showed me some of the episodes. And I got kind of jonesed to make an outer space, a space opera. And I realized once I started to familiarize myself with Captain Kirk that he reminded me of Captain Hornblower, which was the books by C.S. Forester that I read when I was a kid about a captain in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars who had adventures and a girl in every port, which sounded good to me. I was 12. Anyway, 13 or something. And so I thought, oh, this is Hornblower in outer space. This is destroyers. This is submarines. So I made a deal with Paramount and Harv Bennett to direct a Star Trek movie for them, which was going to be their second movie. And Harv said, draft 5 of the script is coming in. So I went home and waited for draft 5. And, I looked up and it was 3 or 4 weeks later and wondered whatever happened, because I was starting to think about spaceships and stuff like that. And he said, oh, I can't send you the script. It's not good. I can't send. I said, well, what about draft 4, draft 3, whatever? And he said, you don't understand. All these different drafts are simply separate attempts to get another Star Trek movie. They're unrelated. And I said, well, send them all to me. I want to read them. And he said, really? I said, yeah. And in those days, you didn't hit send. A truck drove up, like a van, and it had a lot of scripts. And I'm a very slow reader, and I sat and I read all these scripts. And then I said, why don't you and your producing partner, Robert Sallin, come up to my house and let's have a chat about this, because I have an idea. And so they showed up, and I had my ubiquitous legal pad. And I said, why don't we make a list of everything we like in these 5 scripts? It could be a major plot. It could be a subplot. It could be a sequence. It could be a scene. It could be a character. It could be a line of dialogue. I don't care. Let's just make the list. And then I'll try to write a new screenplay that incorporates as many of these elements as we pick. And they didn't look happy. And I thought, well, I don't get a lot of ideas. This was my idea. And I said, what's wrong with what's wrong with that? And they said, well, the problem is that if we don't have a screenplay within 12 days, Industrial Light and Magic, the special effects house for the movie, say they can't deliver the shots in time for the June opening. And I said, what June opening? You know, I'd only directed one movie in my life, and I said and these guys had booked the theaters for a movie that didn't exist. And I said, well, okay. I'll try to do this in 12 days, but we got to pick the stuff now. And they still weren't happy. And I said, so what is it? What's the problem? And they said, well, you know, let's be honest, we couldn't even make your deal in 12 days. And at this point, I was like foaming at the mouth. I said, look, guys, forget the deal, forget the money, forget the credit. I'm not talking about directing. We've already got that signed, sealed, and delivered. But if we don't do this now, there's going to be no movie. Yes or no? You know, and I was an idiot because I, at that point, gave away, you know, what turned out to be significant. So I didn't invent Kirk Meets His Son. I didn't invent Khan. I didn't invent Savick. I didn't invent the Genesis plan. I didn't invent any of those things. I just took them and played with them like a Rubik's Cube and poured essentially it's all my dialogue from Harv wrote a few lines, but I wrote most of it.
Well, it certainly worked.
Oh boy. Yeah, absolutely. And I will not bring up The Undiscovered Country because I promised John I wouldn't. But
we need to get back to Holmes.
Yeah, that was it.
Let's get back to Holmes. But Nick, you held up the yellow legal pad. In the memoir, you mentioned that's how you wrote the first Holmes. Are all the Holmes books still written out by hand first?
Parts of them maybe, and certainly notes of them. Of the one I'm working on now, there's a lot of dates and chronologies and stuff written down to make sure I've got something right.
How concerned are you with the Holmes chronology and the timeline?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's what I was going to ask too. Is how much of that? How are you trying to stay within the sort of?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I play the game. When I wrote the 7% Solution, and I was, I think, 26 or 27 when I wrote it, I have hardly seen a Holmes movie that I didn't despise. I just don't like them. I don't like a lot of the imitations that I've read, because I didn't think, I guess in this area, and probably this area only, I am an arch conservative. I want my Doyle straight. I like it in the books, and I want the books to read like Doyle. It made me crazy to see Nigel Bruce as Watson. I just didn't understand why a genius hangs out with a jerk. And that portrayal didn't make sense as the narrator of those stories. I just couldn't fit it. So when I started to write the 7% Solution, I was very concerned with staying in the chronology and getting as many of the Doyle-Watson details right, even to Watson's mistakes, because he makes a lot of them, because Doyle couldn't be bothered. This was not important stuff to him. His historical novels, his science fiction, that was the important stuff. But for me, it was all important. When I started writing or trying to write the 7% Solution, I was doing it on a Smith Corona portable electric, which is what I owned. And it didn't come out like Doyle. And that's when I switched to longhand, because that's how he had done it. Now I tell myself I can do it on a computer.
The 7% solution is very interesting. You took one thing and you extrapolated out from that an entire kind of reality about homes that had not been explored. And it's similar to kind of what your father did with Houdini. And I just, did that ever occur to you that there's a similarity there somehow?
Well, I did 7% before he did Houdini. That's
So he owes you then.
Oh yeah, big time. It's interesting. I was not the first person to put together Holmes and Freud. In fact, Freud knew that he'd been compared to Holmes. Freud loved to read Sherlock Holmes stories. That was his bedtime reading. And at some point, he even wrote in one of his case histories, "I followed the labyrinth of her mind, Sherlock Holmes-like, until it led me to." So he knew about this comparison. And there was a doctor at Yale, famous psychiatrist, drug expert, who wrote a paper that my father gave me to read about Holmes, Freud, and the cocaine connection, because Holmes is a cocaine user, and for a time, so was Freud. And when my book came out and was the #1 best-selling novel in the United States for 40 weeks, I got sued by this doctor at Yale for plagiarism. This is like the first successful thing I'd ever done in my life. And this guy was saying I ripped him off because he was probably walking across campus and people were saying, "Hey, doc, hey, professor, that guy in the New York Times, he ripped you off." So I got sued. This is how you know you're a hit, is when you get sued. But it was devastating to me. It was devastating and it was expensive because I had to defend myself. I had a lawyer, and the lawyer said, "They have no case. We will ask for something called summary judgment." And I said, "Does that mean we have to wait till July?" And he goes, No. It's not about that." I couldn't resist.
Summary judgment.
Summary judgment. Yeah, that happened in the summertime. Summary judgment turns out to mean that the facts of the case are not in dispute. No one can dispute that I read his essay. I put it in my acknowledgments. I thanked him for it. I read it. The question is, what is the definition of plagiarism? It turns out you cannot copyright an idea. You can only copyright the expression of an idea. The words. I hadn't used his words. I hadn't used any of his words. I didn't write an academic paper. I wrote a novel. I wrote a story. So I won. And then he appealed. And I won again. End of story. So it's, it didn't originate with me. Nothing originates with me. Moby Dick was based on another whale. Emma Bovary was a real person. On and on and on.
It's a theme we keep coming back to.
Yeah, really.
I was blown away by the amount of detail in The Return of the Pharaoh. And I'm guessing you must have had stacks of yellow legal pads with notes.
The Return of the Pharaoh originated with a suggestion by my longtime friend and agent who said, "What about Holmes in Egypt?" And yes, there was an enormous amount of research done in about 4 different areas. One, ancient Egypt, because this is about a search for a missing pharaoh's tomb. 2, the turn of the 20th century Egypt, the Egypt that Holmes and Watson find themselves in when they go looking for a missing archaeologist, a missing nobleman. 3, some medical information pertaining to Watson's wife and her illness. And we're talking about 1910, 1911 in that area. In addition to sort of local Egyptian, information, whether we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, the British dominance, the importance of the Suez Canal, and so forth. It certainly helped that I was in Egypt in 1979 for, a week or so. And I had been in Alexandria, I had been in Cairo, I had crawled up the robbers' entrance in the Great Pyramid, which, as I say, is not an exercise for the faint of heart, because it's very narrow and it's very dark and there's no turning around because there isn't room and there are people behind you. And I asked myself halfway up, what was I doing? But I just thought, well, I have to do this.
It was a very claustrophobic moment in the book, and I'm glad that I only had to read about it and not do it.
I'm glad I managed to convey it. The Kamsin, the big sandstorm, I read about these sandstorms, and I decided, we needed one in the story. So this particular one is invented out of whole cloth. I just made it up. And by the way, as it says in the book, the real ones could last over a month, and mine just lasts, like 24 hours or something. But yeah, I learned about that stuff, and you do a lot of reading. I have whole shelves full of information on the various books and movies that I've written about. Books are a mania. If I'm at your house and we're having a conversation and there's a bookshelf behind you, chances are, and I apologize in advance, I won't be looking at you while we're talking. I'll be looking over your shoulder to see what you got. It's a disease.
It's interesting. We're going to wrap up now because we've taken up way too much of your time, but we did start with Houdini and we're ending with Holmes. But one of the first things we talked about was the title card at the beginning of the Houdini miniseries. What you're about to see is fact. It's also fiction. We defy you to tell the difference. And that's, I'm learning now from Return of the Pharaoh, you're still doing that. You're taking fact, you're taking fiction, and like you did with Wrath of Khan, you're going, I like this, and I like that, and I like this, and I like that, and I'm going to make them all work, which is...
well, that's what E.L. Doctorow did in Ragtime. It's what we call them historical novels. If you read a history or a biography, you understand that in good faith, efforts have been made to lay out the facts. But when you read a historical novel, you understand that the facts have been mushed around and dramatized, that the author has assumed the dramatist's privilege, his prerogative, to help things along. There's an Italian phrase, "Si non è vero è ben trovato." If it didn't happen that way, it should have. Give you another example. Queen Elizabeth I and her cousin and rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth subsequently had beheaded, never met. In real life, they never met. But of all the 4,622 movies, plays, operas, novellas, ballets, whatever, they always meet.
Yeah.
Because it ain't cool if they don't meet.
Right.
It's a better story. Yeah.
It's a better story.
Can I take just a few more seconds to have you tell us one more story, because I love it. And it's one that only you can tell, because you're the only one on this podcast and one of the few people in the world who's had a Thanksgiving dinner with Albert Einstein. Can you tell us what happened at that meal?
We ate turkey.
Yeah. Anything else?
Okay, well, all right. Oh, you want more? My father had 3 sisters, the middle of whom was married to a man named Harold Chernus. Harold Chernus, no T, was the most famous Hellenist in the world, which means an expert on ancient Greece, things ancient Greek. He was the editor of the Harvard Loeb Plutarch. He was the author of Aristotle's criticism of Plato in the Academy. He was, I believe, the second PhD in Sanskrit. He was the Sanskrit teacher at Berkeley of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. At the end of the Second World War, Oppenheimer became the head of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where Einstein was. And Oppenheimer invited my uncle and my aunt, my father's sister, to come to the Institute, where they spent the last 30 some odd years of their life at a house on 98 Battle Road. And we lived in New York City, and Thanksgiving on different occasions would happen at our house, at another sister's house in White Plains or Katona outside New York City, or at the other sister's house in Princeton. And at those dinners, I think there were 2 of them. And, mind you, you're talking to someone who is like 7 or 8 years old. So what I remember about this is not necessarily accurate. For example, I remember that there were 2 dinners over successive years. Maybe it was 1. I don't know. I can't remember. I think it was 2. And at these dinners were my uncle, my aunt, my father, my mother, Erwin Panofsky, who was the most famous iconologist in the world, Albert Einstein, I was seated next to him on at least one occasion, J. Robert Oppenheimer, his wife Kitty, and their daughter, who I think's name was Tony, I think. And the story that I was told, because I don't remember this, was that sitting next to Einstein, I said something like, "I have a hair in my turkey." And Einstein said, "Not so loud, everyone else will want one."
Lance Burton.
So before we dive into Billy Toppet, had you worked as a consultant on movies in the past?
Well, no. I've worked a couple of times over the years trying to teach actor friends to do magic for stage shows or plays or things like that. And then while we were shooting Billy Toppet, I was hired to be the magic consultant on Oz the Great and Powerful. So I had to teach James Franco to do magic. And most of the magic he did was in the beginning of the movie when he was still in Kansas. But he was a very good student and did a good job. And it was a really fun experience. And I spent about a month on the set in Michigan when they were filming that movie.
Did that have any impact on how you made Billy Toppet, having spent a month on a bigger budget set?
It was an interesting experience because I actually shut down production on Billy Toppet to go and work. I thought, well, this would be a good experience to go and as you say, be part of a big budget movie. So Oz the Great and Powerful, there was maybe 300 or 400 people there on set with all the actors and the extras and the crew, and there was armies of people building sets. They had sound stages up there near Pontiac, Michigan, and I think there were 7 or 8 giant sound stages, and they were building sets in all of them. And we'd start shooting on stage 1 and shoot there for a week, and as soon as we were done, we'd move to stage 2, and they would start tearing that one apart and building a new set. So they were just sort of working their way around to all the sound stages. It was really amazing.
Almost like magic.
Yeah.
Let's talk just a bit about, before we dive into Billy Toppet, which I enjoyed immensely. Mm-hmm. How do you think movies have portrayed magicians in the past, Lance?
It's all over the board. A lot of times when I go see a movie that has a magician as a lead character, frequently I'm very disappointed by the magic, because in my mind I'm thinking, well, they could have done this scene a lot better, and they could have done that a lot better. But I'm looking at it, I'm too close to the subject matter. I'm sort of inside the ballpark looking at it. Well, the first time that I got to do a television drama and play a magician was on Knight Rider, and that was about 1985. And I played the part of Austin Templeton, who was this magician / assassin. That was part of the plot. And the producers on that show were great. They hired me, obviously knowing that I was a professional magician. And right up front, Bert Armus, the lead producer on the show, said to me, "Lance, just put as much magic as you can in this. Even if there's a scene where there's no magic, you can be, rolling a coin on your fingers or doing something. We just want to keep it interesting." So they just sort of gave me carte blanche, and I went through the script, and the script was very good. The writer came up with some really clever ways to incorporate magic into the action, but obviously he wasn't as familiar with magic as I was. So I was trying to beef up the magic all during the shooting. For instance, there was a cloth hood that goes over Templeton's head while he's doing an escape. And this hood turned out to be an important clue in one of the murders. And Michael Knight finds this hood as he's investigating the murder. So he confronts Templeton with it and says, "Aha, this belongs to you, doesn't it?" And in the script, it says, "Oh yeah, that's mine." And then the script says he opens up a silver canister, shows it empty, and starts pulling a bunch of hoods out of it and says, or should I say, it's one of the hoods I use, sort of proving that, well, yeah, that's mine, but anybody could have taken it. I have dozens of these hanging around. Well, I read that in the script, And in my mind, I'm thinking, I don't want to do a silver tube prop to produce hoods. So I worked out a method to do it that didn't use any props. And I went and showed it to the director on the day we were getting ready to film. And he said, yeah, that's good. Do that. And what it was I pick up the hood and look at it and go, yeah, that's my hood. And then I drop the hood, leaving both of my hands in full view. And I would just reach out into the air, pow, and catch a hood in the right hand and pow. And there's another hood in the left. And it's a silk handkerchief production, but it just appears in your hand like that. And then I walked over to Michael Knight and I reached inside his jacket, pulled out a couple of hoods. I sort of tweaked the magic a little bit to make it a little more visual and a little more interesting. And I think it improved the scene.
Yeah.
That sounds fantastic. I love Billy Toppet. Both Jim and I did. And it reminded me of, I've made a number of low budget movies in my life, about a half dozen of them. And the driving force behind them has almost always been, let's get together with some friends and make a movie. And I got the sense that that was kind of part of the DNA of Billy Toppet. Is that right?
Well, yes. I just have to correct you on one thing. Billy Toppet was not a low budget movie. It was a no budget movie. we literally just decided, I'm not going to spend any money. Everyone volunteered. So if it ever makes any money, I'll go back and pay the actors.
Well, okay, but as someone who has done the same thing you've done a half dozen times with no money, the results you got, given the no money status, your sound is exceptional, which is one of the things that's normally a big sign that it's a low budget movie is the sound's not good. You have the recording of the voices is, I know it sounds mundane, but it's a hard thing to get right. And when you do get it right, it makes it sound like a big budget movie. The cinematography is terrific. The editing is fantastic. I don't know if you bought the music or if someone did the music, but whatever it was, it fit perfectly and it just sailed along. So for a movie that had no budget, you did an exceptional job of making a real movie.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, but you're right. The sound is the one thing you really don't want to skimp on because that's something you really can't fix in post a lot of the times. So we did try to pay attention to the sound recording. As far as the music goes, some of the music was from my show that I already owned, some of the performance pieces.
Yeah.
Some of the music we used just for the movie, and that was rights-free music that I got from a company called Digital Juice.
Mm-hmm.
And they have all different sorts of music and it's searchable. So you can find, rock and roll, hard driving music. You can find, instrumentals. They have everything. And so, and then there was a couple of pieces that a friend of mine who's a musician wrote and recorded for me. And one of the pieces in the film, my lead actress, Joelle Righetti, she had actually recorded an album a couple of years ago. And she gave me the album during the production and said, hey, anything on here you want, you're welcome to use. And I listened to it and there was one track. I went, this is perfect for this one scene I have. And it's the scene where the whole cast is waking up on the second day, brushing their teeth and getting ready to go out. And that's actually the lead actress singing.
The stuff you picked all really meshed well together.
Oh, thank you. And it was during the post-production process when it really struck me as we were editing and doing that, how much the music adds to a production, not just a live show. I already knew that for a live show, but as I was making the film, it really just struck me again, wow, music really does add a whole new dimension to the movie or a live show.
Yeah. So where did the idea for the movie come from?
Well, I'll tell you exactly where it came from. When I was a kid, there was a television series on TV called The Magician, starring Bill Bixby. And now it only lasted one season because the network got a new president that came in and he just, canceled all his predecessor shows. But it actually did good in the ratings. But it only lasted 22 episodes. And the magic consultant on The Magician was Mark Wilson. And so when I moved out west, I met Mark Wilson and became friends with him. And then when I did in 1985, when I was shooting Knight Rider, guess who they hired to provide all of the large illusions and props for the episode? Mark Wilson. and he was the sort of the magic advisor on that television show. So Mark and I got to hang out for 7 days on the set as we were shooting, and he's actually in the episode. You can see shots of him. He's sitting in the audience during one of the opening performances that Austin Templeton does, and in fact I get him up on stage at one point as a volunteer. So anyway, one day after filming, Mark and I are going out to dinner, and we're in his car and we're driving along, and he says to me, "Lance, how do you like doing this work?" And I said, "What do you mean, Mark? You mean like this episode?" He says, "Yeah, how do you like, acting on this TV show?" And I said, "Oh, I'm having the time of my life. I get to do magic, I get to act, I get to work with a stuntman. This is great." And he says, "Well, you're doing a good job, and you ought to think about doing more of this." And I said, "More of this? What do you mean?" He says, "You ought to start a notebook, start keeping some ideas of how you could incorporate your magic into a TV series or a movie, like with the Bill Bixby series." And I thought, that's a good idea. So I did. I started writing every time I had an idea about how to use magic within the context of a drama series or a story. I would write it down. So after a few years, I had all these sort of clever things that I came up with to use magic in propelling the story forward, or to get out of a sticky situation or whatever. And every few years I would pull that out and I'd go, I'm going to try and go pitch this. And I would go to Los Angeles and set up some meetings, and I would try to pitch to do a series every few years. And we got close a couple of times, but we never were able to sell it. But the area I was working in was so similar to things that would pop up on my TV screen later. I kept thinking, man, I've got something here. I just need to, like any kind of magic trick, I get it in my head, and it's frustrating. I got to get it out. I got to put it on the stage because it's like in my brain. It's like scratching the inside of my skull, and it's really annoying. By that time, the technology had progressed to the point where we had these high definition cameras that weren't, astronomically expensive, and we had editing software so that somebody on their laptop could put out a professional looking product. So I finally just said, "Hey, you know what? I'm going to do this." And I called my buddy Michael Callahan, and he came over and we fleshed out the story. And then we wrote the screenplay within like 2 or 3 months. And then we eventually just started casting it and shot it. But it all goes back to Bill Bixby and The Magician from 1973.
Well, most things do. Most things do go back that. Were you always planning on directing?
Directing and acting at the same time is really difficult, but I had been doing it all my life, with my live show. And we started in on this thing. And then at some point, I heard an interview with Barbara Streisand, and someone asked her that question. And they said, "Is it difficult to act and direct in the same production?" And she had a great response. She said, "No, it's easier that way. That's one less person I have to argue with."
She's right. That's that's absolutely right.
So
talk a little bit about how the movie changed, from your initial sort of script or plotting, and then through shooting and editing. Were there a lot of kind of, let's do this, that didn't work?
Well, I'll tell you what, when I first had the idea, I didn't have a real clear idea of the tone I wanted to take. As far as it could have been a drama, it could have been a comedy or whatever. But I started chatting with my buddy Michael Callahan. Now, Michael worked in my show as my special guest star. We've been friends for since the mid '80s. And Michael said this was his idea, so I give him credit. He says we should write this as a family film. And I said, "Why is that?" He says, "Because I have 2 small children, and about 2 or 3 times a year, I have to take them to the movies, and we have to pick a family film, and they're always horrible." And so I'd like to see a good family film.
Yeah.
Something good we could take the kids to see. And I said, okay, that's fine. You know, that fits. Magic's always been considered a good family entertainment. So we chose to write it as a family friendly movie and as a comedy. But I give credit to Michael for that. And it didn't alter that much once we had the script completed. The idea was, you know, to keep to the script as close as we can within reason. Now, there were some scenes that were improvised, and there were some things that I added during the course of the movie. Well, I'll tell you one thing that we added. The film starts with a dream sequence with Billy floating a lady in the air, and then he wakes up in bed, and you realize, oh, that was just a dream. He doesn't really have a big Las Vegas show. He's a birthday party magician. And that was the first thing we shot. So as we were shooting, I read a book by Robert Rodriguez about his experience shooting El Mariachi. And that was recommended to me by Rory Johnston, who played the bad guy in my movie. And when I explained to Rory what we were going to do, he said, oh, you're doing like a no budget movie like Robert Rodriguez. And I said, who's Robert Rodriguez? He said, oh, he's this director. And he started out by making this movie called El Mariachi. He had $7,000. That was it. And he made a whole film. And so I bought the DVD to watch. I wanted to see what a $7,000 movie looked like. And then I read his book, and he had some really interesting advice and thoughts. And he was talking about the power of three, and which magicians will do also, where you'll have a callback or something keeps popping back up, and it happens 3 times. And in El Mariachi, there's like this sort of dream sequence, but it happens 3 times. And I started thinking, he's got a really good point there. So I started thinking, where else could I insert? I need 2 more dream sequences, and I got to find a place to insert them. So we wrote 2 more dream sequences and found the right place to put them, and we shot that. But that kind of happened once we started shooting.
You know, John, as he's mentioned, has shot some low budget movies here, and they're populated largely by friends of John. And I get the sense that, you know, in watching your movie, that these people are all your buddies, that that you just tap all your pals and say,
exactly,
let's put this together. And
That's
it's
exactly.
so much to see. But so is everybody in the movie? You didn't cast this? I mean, these are all your friends?
Oh yeah, they're all my friends. The only time there were people in the movie really that I didn't know up until that point was you know, like extras in the restaurant. You know, we would just ask people, do you have any friends that you can come over and be background actors? And a lot of them are my friends. And like the birthday party scene, those kids, those are all kids of friends. It's like, hey, if you got kids, bring them over to my stage manager's house.
It really looks like you guys are having fun throughout the whole movie. It is, I don't mean to denigrate it in any way, it's a really goofy movie. It is surprisingly silly in a really fun way.
It's a silly movie. And a lot of that stuff also, I have to, you know, Michael Goudeau is, everybody loves Michael and loves his comedy, and kids especially love him. So we wanted to go for something. For instance, when we were writing the date scene, you know, that was a silly scene, and they were doing the game with the milk, the little milk containers. And Michael said, listen, when I take my kids to a movie, when it gets to the date scene, they are bored. They are like, oh, they're falling asleep going, oh, when is this over? So let's beef this up with something silly. And I'm, hey, great. That sounds great. So again, a lot of that stuff was just, the purpose of the movie was to keep everybody's interest.
And that's probably something you've learned from being on stage forever, is feeling when the audience might be getting bored and being ahead of them.
Yeah. You don't want to get to that point. You want to keep it moving.
Is your friend Michael in the movie?
Yes, he is in the movie. He's one of the jugglers.
Okay.
Yeah.
The taller one or the shorter one?
The shorter one.
Okay.
He was my co-writer on the screenplay and also co-executive producer.
You know, there's a line in the movie where they talk about you personally on stage doing your magic, and then your persona off stage. Talk to me just a little bit about that difference. And was that sort of a convention just for this movie, or Is that tell me about that.
Well, that's pretty common thing with stage performers and magicians, that most of us are one person off stage and a better version of ourselves on stage, more confident version, and a more elegant version, and a more witty version of ourselves. So yeah, I think that's a pretty common thing across the board with all magicians or jugglers or stand-up comics.
So what was your process in creating the Lance Burton image on stage that we're also familiar with?
Well, that's a 40-year long process. When I was a kid, I would see the pictures of Channing Pollock and I said, oh, I want to be that guy, and I think everybody starts like that. I was a big Bill Bixby fan because of The Magician. And of course, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, and then The Incredible Hulk. But, when I was a teenager, I would go to the barber shop and I'd say, cut my hair like Bill Bixby. And they'd look at me and go, what?
Well, better that than Lou Ferrigno. I think he looks better as Bill Bixby. So you're talking about creating your stage persona. And like I mentioned earlier, our big theme this season has been how do you create a better magician? Is there one thing you think magicians are currently doing that they should look at doing better?
Well, that's a really good question. My advice, for the past 25, 30 years, I've been the sponsor of the Teen Seminar, which is currently at the International Brotherhood of Magicians at their annual convention. So one of the things I try to emphasize in talking to young magicians is the power of repeat performances. People look at my career, and my first time on Johnny Carson was October 28th, 1981. And I sort of burst onto the scene from that appearance. And that led to me going to Las Vegas and getting my first job there, and so on and so on. And there's this common misconception that that's when my career started, on that Johnny Carson appearance. But what they don't understand is there were 1,000 performances leading up to that appearance. I started doing birds and cards and candles and zombie when I was, 12 years old, 14 years old. And I counted them up. I did over 1,000 performances of that act before I got to the Tonight Show. And that's really what it takes to put together a professional act. That should be your goal, is to get 1,000 shows under your belt. And it's not just me. Over the years, this is a question I've always been interested in. So whenever I meet a great magician, that's what I ask them. How did you learn to do your act? Where did you perform your act? So for instance, Jeff McBride. Jeff and I met when we were like 23 years old, 24 years old, but we had been hearing about each other since we were teenagers. I lived in Kentucky and Jeff was in New York, but we would hear about each other at the magic conventions and see pictures of each other. So it was like two gunslingers meeting, when we finally crossed paths, and we became good friends. And I asked Jeff, and Jeff had a little club in New York called Club Ibis, and he would go there and he would do 2 or 3 shows a night, banging out his act, show after show after show, year after year. And he was only getting paid, a very little amount to go there. And, the other magicians in New York, Jeff always says the other magicians in New York would make fun of him because they're saying, Jeff, you're getting $50 a week or $100 a week to perform at this little club. I get $100 a show. And Jeff always says, and you know what? They're still doing that. They're still getting $100 a show. But every magician, every great magician I've ever talked to has a very similar story. Eugene Berger, he banged out thousands of shows at the restaurants, bars there in Chicago. Really, everybody you can think of that's a great magician, they'll tell you a similar story.
Yeah, we had Jeff McBride on a couple episodes ago, and he said something that stuck with me and will stick with me forever, and will, I think, be part of an upcoming Eli Marks book, in which he was referring to martial arts, and he said, "I'm not afraid of the man who knows 1,000 kicks. I'm afraid of the man who knows one kick and has done it 1,000 times." And that seems like such a good thing for magicians to think about: is not learning 1,000 tricks, but learn one trick and do it 1,000 times.
Yes, the one I always like is the definition of an amateur magician versus a professional magician is this: an amateur magician does different tricks every day for the same audience. And a professional magician does the same tricks every day for a different audience.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. Can I go back to Billy Toppet just for a second?
Sure.
I just, at the very end in the credits, there's some very clever, funny little teases about the possibility of a sequel. And I was sort of like, gosh, I hope there is a sequel, because this could be a series.
Yeah.
Is there talk of that? Of you doing another one?
And I will say, I'm going to speak for my my podcast partner here. We are standing by, ready to help you if you want to do a sequel.
Absolutely. I drop everything.
Billy Toppet Part 2, The Empire Strikes Back. Billy Toppet Part 2, The Search for Spock. I tell you, that was just me on this computer, by the way, that I'm talking to you on, getting at the end of the editing process and doing the credits, and it's just going, oh, this will be funny. just me making up silly stuff.
And the image of you doing that, of sitting on a computer and editing, do you have the filmmaking bug now? Are you gonna? It doesn't have to be a sequel to Billy Toppet, but
I enjoyed. Here's the thing that I enjoyed the most on the whole process was learning to edit. My good buddy Bob Massey was our director of photographer and our editor, but in the process of editing, I would go over to his house and we would work on it, and then he'd have to go do something. I was like, do we have to stop? And he said, one day he said, I can give you the software. I bought this and I can put it on 2 computers legally. So if you want to, I'll show you how. I went, yeah. So I went out, I bought this computer right here that I'm talking to you on. And I thought, okay, I got my normal laptop. That's for my everyday stuff. And this is going to be my editing laptop. And I put the stuff on and I started to learn how to edit. And Bob was there to help me, show me. I really loved it. I really, really loved the process. And a lot of it is very similar to magic. I'll give you a good example of that. There's a scene at the end of the movie where they've opened the big show. And I do the sawing a couple into 8 pieces. So we got the boy and the girl, and they get sawed up, and they come out of the boxes at the end, and the boy's wearing the girl's clothes, and they chase each other off stage, and then they run past the camera, and then the second shot, you see them run into view in the wings, and then they have a scene in the wings. Well, we shot the first part with doing the trick and then running past the camera. We shot that at the Monte Carlo Hotel in 2010. And then the scene in the wings we shot in 2013 on the other side of town at Rory Johnson's church that he went to, and they allowed us to shoot there. So the 2 scenes that are supposed to be at the same time were shot 3 years apart, different locations. And as we were shooting the first one, I knew in my mind what I wanted to do. I wanted them to run past the camera, and then I would pick it up, and the rest of the cast hadn't even been cast yet. By the way, I didn't even know who the other actors were going to be, but I knew there was a scene over there. So as they run past, I'll pick it up whenever we get to that. 3 years later, we shoot the thing. Now I'm editing it together. So now I take the music from the first part of the shot that's playing during the trick and the audience reaction. Mm-hmm. You get the audience applauding and cheering, and they run past the camera. We go to the second shot, but you still hear the audio. You still hear the music playing, and you hear me out on stage going, thank you, and the audience applauding. And so now when you put it all together, it's like, it's seamless. No one knows that those were shot 3 years apart. It's like a magic trick. It's an illusion. There's a good example of how the sound helps enhance the illusion. Yep. And there are a few magic tricks that we do on stage that sound is a very big part of the illusion.
I don't know at what point in the process you read Robert Rodriguez's book, but he based El Mariachi on what he had available. He wrote the script based on the town, the bar, the tortoise, the dog, all of that. Yes. You seem to have done a very similar thing in that you had, I'm guessing you already had some footage you on stage, or it was a relatively easy thing to get. For an average person, that's a really hard thing to get, but for you, that would be.
Exactly. And I had to shoot all that before the show closed, because the show, we were getting ready to close the show. So we captured all of that, all the stuff that had to be shot in the theater. We captured that.
But for the average person writing a
Right.
script to have written that scene, you go, well, you can't shoot that. I mean,
Well, of course.
the lights alone in the ceiling are a million
But
times more than your budget.
But I was well aware that I had this, I had this opportunity, that we'd written it into the script, and it's like, okay, I got to shoot this now, because if I wait another 2 months, it's all going to be gone.
Exactly. And I felt the same with the scenes in the casino, which would be, I think, normally a difficult thing to do, but you obviously had a relationship and were able to make those happen.
Now, the casino scenes, those were all shot afterwards. That was my buddy John Woodrum, who owned this little casino called the Klondike. I talked to several. We wanted it to be a locals type casino, and I talked to a few of the casinos, and some of them were like, yeah, we'd let you come in here and shoot. We have a coffee shop. How many days do you need it? How much? And I'm like going to myself, I don't know how long this is going to take to shoot. I've never shot a movie before. And then finally I went over to see my buddy John, and I said, John, I've got this movie I'm shooting, and some of the action takes place in the casino, and there's a coffee shop, and you've got a coffee shop. And what would you think about us shooting here in your, and he looks at me and says, yeah, whatever you want, come on in. It's like, what?
That's what
Come
you
on
need.
in. Anytime. It's like, okay, I found our location.
You are a low budget filmmaker at heart. You got all the tricks that are necessary to be good at this. And you did it on your first movie. That's exceptional.
It was a fun process, and it's not dissimilar to shooting a television special or a TV show, but it is a little different. There's obviously magic in it, but there's also the second element of the story and doing the scene and the acting and getting all the actors all on the same page.
And speaking of the actors, I was thrilled to see our friend Louis Anderson
Yes.
in there. He was a Twin Cities guy who I knew back when he was here, and I had the good fortune of working with him a couple times in the corporate arena. And to see Johnny Thompson obviously having so much fun, it was just great. And then to see Mac kind of turn up. I don't want to spoil it, but he does turn up.
Mac turns up there near the end of the film. It was great fun being able to work with Johnny, to be able to direct your mentor. Is a really special thing. And that was just so much fun working with Johnny. And he was just so good in this role. And
Well, he was such a good actor. He really had that ability to turn it on.
And Pam too. Pam.
Oh yeah, Pam was in there as well. It was just so much fun to see them just pop up like that.
A delight. The whole thing was from start to finish a delight. I watched it by myself after my wife went to bed, and I just was giggling through the whole thing.
Thank you. Here's my favorite story from the whole process. I had this idea to do the trick with the on the telephone, the wizard, that anybody that is an amateur magician, knows the trick. Well, when Michael and I were coming up with a storyline, I had this idea of using the wizard as part of the kidnapping thing to find out where the assistant was being held. And in order to do that, of course, I had to show what the wizard was, and so my idea was, the reason I wanted to include that was I wanted kids especially to be able to watch the movie, and then after the movie take something away. I wanted them to be able to perform the wizard for their friends. And after we had our premiere, my wardrobe lady from the Monte Carlo, and she also did wardrobe on the movie, she called me like a week later. Her and her husband, her stepdaughter, who was in like junior high school at that time, she called to tell me that the little girl had gone to school the next day and had performed the wizard for her friends. And when I heard that, I was like, yes, touchdown.
Mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted kids to go and actually perform a magic trick for their friends.
That trick, my brother is a magician, and he used to do that with my dad. So when I was a kid, the phone would ring and my dad would say, clubs, hearts. Okay. And so he brought back so many great memories for me. But I really liked how you then turned it around and used it as a plot device. So it wasn't just a sort of a throwaway. It sort of was like, oh, well, that dovetails so nicely into the whole story.
It's integral to the story.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And those are especially the kind of things I like with magic in movies or TV shows, where you can take something and bring it back in later use it as a practical device.
Yeah. Well, we could talk with you all day on this, but I promised Lynn we would keep it short. But we do want to end with one. I want to end with one key question, because this is the last episode of season 2. It's the last time we'll be talking about the Bullet Catch book in depth. After this interview, the listener will hear the final chapter of the Bullet Catch. So we wonder, what has been your experience with the Bullet Catch trick and your thoughts on it in general?
Well, I never did the bullet catch. I've seen a couple people do it over the years, and I've seen it, on television demonstrated. And as we know, there's been a number of magicians that died doing the bullet catch. Probably the most famous being Billy Robinson, Chung Ling Soo.
Yeah.
So it could be a dangerous thing. I never went in that direction with the bullet catch. And it's the same reason I never did the razor blade tricks, like the needle trick. But you take razor blades, and for people that don't know, you show that they're sharp, and you swallow them, and then you thread, and then you pull them out of your mouth, and they're threaded on the thread. And I started working on it because I saw Ricciardi do it, and he had a really dramatic version of it. And I started working on it. And I was working on it for about a month. And then finally one day I thought, if I do this, I'm not going to work on something and then not, I was doing a lot of television shows, TV specials and stuff. So I was like, do I really want to do this on TV? Do I want impressionable kids to see this and then, God forbid, try to mimic it or something? So I thought, if that had happened, I would feel terrible. That would mess me up. And so I just, okay, that's it. I'm not doing this trick. And I stopped, and I never performed it and never finished it. I kind of felt the same way about the bullet catch, that, I don't want to tell anybody else what to do, but if I did that and something happened, I mean, I couldn't live with myself. I couldn't, that would mess me up. I would never be able to go on stage again.
Mac King.
Do you remember when you first started performing Cards Across without the Cloak of Invisibility?
I never did do Cards Across without Cloak of Invisibility, really.
Okay.
In my show. So the history of that, I had the Cloak of Invisibility before.
Okay.
Without Cards Across.
Okay.
How did you use it before?
So here's kind of the evolution of that trick. When I was in my early 20s, I shared a house in downtown Louisville with a guy named Tom Hamilton, also a magician. Mm-hmm. And it was a big old house and had a library. And so I was sitting in our library reading one afternoon, and Tom tiptoes into the library wearing a clear rain poncho. And he just tiptoed around the room in front of me and then back out. And right before he left the room, he turned around and looked at me and he goes, "That is right. I am invisible." And then left the room. And I was doubled over I was laughing so hard. Just the two of us in there. And I had a show that night, like an open mic thing in Louisville. And I'm like, "Tom, can I do that in my show?" He goes, "What?" "Yeah, I want to do that tonight." It's a place called the 3030 Club in Louisville, Kentucky. And so he said, "Yeah, you can try it." And I was dating my wife at the time, my wife to be, and she went with me that night to the club, and she was like, and I told her I was going to do this. She says, "Please don't do that. Please don't do that. That's not going to get any laughs." Oh. No. I can tell you, I was there. It's so funny. I was laughing so hard when Tom did it. So I'm on stage, and I don't know, 5 minutes into my little spot, I put on this poncho and I just tiptoe around the room with a goofy face and tiptoed around the room. And I was working with a mic on a stand at that time. So I tiptoe around and I get back to the mic and I say into the mic, I lean in, say, "That is right. I am invisible." And it was like crickets, like nothing. Uh-oh. Zero laughs. No one's laughing except for my wife, my fiance. She's laughing at me though, not with me at all. And So it was a complete failure. But I did it the next night, also a complete failure. I did it another night, complete failure. I'm like, all right, I don't know. I guess it was a one-time thing. And it just sat in the back of my head for years. And then my friend Pete Studebaker is a magician from Texas, trade show corporate magician guy. And I watched him do Cards Across. We were just hanging out with a bunch of people, lay people in Texas after my show at the Funny Bone or the Improv, I don't remember which, but someplace in Dallas, some club. And we're hanging out, and Pete did Cards Across. And I'm like, man, that is a really graceful, well put together, well thought out handling for the sleight of hand part of that trick. And he said, I learned that from Bob White, who's a card magician also in Texas. And I said, man, it's great. If I ever did Cards Across, I think that's what I would do. Then another few years go by, and I'm thinking about Cards Across, just thinking about new tricks, and then I think about, man, that handling, Pete or Bob White's handling for that Cards Across thing, so elegant. Maybe I can figure out. And then, one of those aha light bulb moments, I'm like, hey, cloak of invisibility. Because I was trying to think of a way to make that trick, fit into my show. It's, as it is, it's a great card trick, but it is just a card trick, and there was no hook or any Mac Kinginess to hang it on. And so the first time putting those two things together was gangbusters. So, it's one of those things where the end result is way more than the sum of the parts. The Cards Across is a good trick, and that cloak invisibility idea I thought was a hilarious idea, but it didn't become hilarious to the audience until it was combined with that card trick. So that's kind of how the evolution of that trick has happened.
It's sort of reinforcing something Lance told us when we talked to him about Billy Toppet, where he said for 20 years, he would just make notes about this would be cool in a movie, that would be cool in a TV show, this would be cool, without ever knowing how he's going to use it. And you had the good sense to somewhere in your mind castle, keep the cloak, and when you needed it, there it was.
It appeared. Yeah, that's right. Well, you must have the same sort of thing. If you're writing these stories, you must think, oh, you know what? That's somehow this trick or this magic method or whatever I'll use that at some point.
That's true. I do have pages and pages of stuff.
Yeah.
But I just go through and go, there's a library classification for magic. That's interesting. I'll drop that in here. Yeah. So, but it's smart to either write it down or remember it. And that's the thing that I sometimes forget.
Yeah. Writing. That memory thing is, that's the hard part. Yeah.
Mac, so I love that story and how the trick evolved. Has it in performance, because how long have you been doing it now with the cloak of invisibility?
More than 20 years.
Okay. So has it evolved? How has it evolved over those 20 years?
Hopefully it's tightened up a little bit. I think when I first started doing it, it was like 10 minutes long, and now it's about 6. And every now and again, when I do like a theater show, like a longer, with an intermission and 45-minute first half, 40-minute second half, I go back to I add back in stuff that I edited out over the years. Let's see, I'm trying to think, initially, because Tom's thing when he was tiptoeing around in our library, those many years ago, what year, that would have been like 83. So, it sat on the, in the back of my head for 15 years before I did it in the show again, after that initial failure. But I think Tom was using a clear rain poncho, because I'm sure that's what he had. But I sort of in my head, like, okay, that's one of the reasons it's funny is you can see him underneath there or whatever. And initially I used clear ponchos when I was doing a clear poncho. But over the course of the time, I sort of found that people are more sort of familiar with the yellow one, and that for some reason got a little bit better reaction than the clear one.
Well, it's brighter and it really jumps out, and it's
yeah. It's certainly not invisible in any way. That's right.
No, that's true. Are there other examples in your act of something that's like a couple pieces have gestated and then they've come together and created a routine?
It's interesting. Billy McComb Irish magician, sort of. I mean, I don't feel like I ever, unfortunately, had a mentor. I didn't have anybody growing up, that like a coach or whatever, or anybody to help me out. But once I met Billy, I kind of, he kind of did partly become that. So in one of Billy's books, 25 Years Wiser, Billy talks about combining two tricks into one routine. So I feel like I've had a lot of success kind of doing that, right? I mean, this trick and that trick together. The cloak invisibility is, it's not much of a trick, but it's I don't know. The example in Billy's book, is a card to wallet. He combines it with a couple of other things and makes it a better trick than just a plain card to wallet. And so that advice has sort of stuck with me. I'm trying to think in my show. I mean, the last trick before my encore, the last trick is a signed bill that's destroyed and then ends up inside a telephone receiver. And over the years, I mean, when I first started doing that trick, it was based on the Terry Seabrook bill and wallet, and that I kind of did word for word. Terry sold that manuscript and wallet with all of his jokes and all of his lines and all of his methods put out there for anybody to use who bought it. And I did it word for word like Terry Seabrook, initially, in my late teens. Over the years, I wanted to change it, like you were saying, the idea is to make it more and more about more and more you, take these sort of standard tricks and make them more you. And so when Mike Caveney's Magic Comedy book came out, not the big 2-volume thing that he recently published, but years ago he put out a single volume called Magic Comedy, and it had his bill and cigar. I'm like, oh, way less people are doing the bill and cigar than are doing bill in the wallet.
Yeah.
And he had an intricate mechanism that a friend of mine, I don't know, the name Tim Starr, Swedish magician, but Tim at one point had lived in St. Louis, Missouri, and I happened to be staying at his house, Lance and I both, and Tim was an amazing metal worker. He had moved to the U.S. to work for Rings and Things, which was made cups and balls and all sorts of metal, linking rings and whatever. And Tim moved to St. Louis, and we were staying with Tim's house, and I showed him this drawing from Mike's book, and the next morning when I woke up, he had already made this amazing contraption out of brass and a way to secretly put a signed bill inside of a sealed cigar. It was an amazing, beautiful piece of apparatus. And so I used that for a long time, and it broke. And then I realized, hey, I don't need this amazing piece of brass. I can do it just with some actual needle and thread inside my coat, some sewing. I don't want to give away too much of this Mike's method, but I said, you don't need all this contraption. You can do it so much more simple. And so then it sort of evolved to that. And years later, when I met Mike Caveney, I was telling him that I had done that. And he says, oh, you know what? Yeah, I put that method in there because I thought no one would do it. But I use the exact same method that you're talking about. Simplified method. That's the method I actually use. And so then I'm like, all right, but this is still Mike's idea, not Mac's idea. And so wanted to figure out a way to make that more my own. And so came up with this, having the money inside the phone receiver. And I think that's early. I mean, things just evolve in such weird ways, right? I mean, I feel like my show, at least, but is more evidence on the side of evolution as opposed to creationism, right? My show evolved. I didn't create it. And so that bill thing with the telephone receiver, there's an old gag that my dad did for me when I was a kid, where you take a dollar bill and you show the wings on the dollar bill. You know this gag? So you say, can you see the wings? Say wing, wing.
Wing,
They
wing.
say wing, wing. You folded it and you say, can you still see the wings? And you fold it so that a little bit of the wings are still visible. And you say, can you still see the wings? Yes. Wing. Say wing, wing. They say wing, wing. Fold it another time. Can you still see them? Yes. Say wing, wing. And then you fold it again and you put it on their hand and you say wing, wing. You say, can you see the wings now? And they say no. And you say wing, wing, and you pick this up and you hold it to your head and you say hello. So it's all this big rigmarole for this stupid gag. And so my dad did that for me when I was a kid. It wasn't a magic trick. It was just something that he knew. My dad was a really funny fellow. So I always liked that gag. And so I was working on the egg bag. This was in my late teens, probably, working on the egg bag and trying to figure out a routine, a finish for the egg bag, because I never felt like it had a good finish. I remember that gag, and I got a telephone receiver with the coily cord and sewed it into the bottom of a duplicate egg bag. So as the egg would disappear, I would have him say chicken, chicken. And then I would say drumstick, drumstick, and it would come back. And I'd say breast, breast, and it would disappear. So I was saying all these parts of a chicken. And so the last one, I had switched the bag that they had previously examined for this bag that had this telephone receiver in it. They're holding the bag, and I say wing, wing, and they'd say wing, wing, and I would reach in and pull out the telephone receiver and say hello. That was the finish to the egg bag. But I never really liked that egg bag trick, and I never had a really great bag switch that was, that I felt satisfied with, that was really fooling. So I discarded that, but that's still in the back of my head, right? And I had these old telephone receivers sitting around, and I thought, you know what? I could have the money end up inside the telephone receiver. That'd be different than anything else. And if I use that word wing, 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 it doesn't make any sense. But I changed that in my head. I'm like, bring, bring are the magic words. And I use those words throughout the show. And then it's paid off at the very last part of the show by me pulling this phone out of my shoe, and inside is the money. And so, I mean, that's evolved over the course of, started with an egg bag, and then but Terry Seabrook's thing and Mike Caveney's thing, and then finally some Matt King in there. And, it's a circuitous. And so this will be part that you cut out where I ramble on and on.
No, but what you're doing, Mac, is you're proving our friend Louis Anderson used to say, I don't hold a grudge, but I never forget anything.
Yeah, right.
And you're not holding a grudge, but you're never forgetting anything. There's always stuff back there that you can kind of, was it Jim, was it Eugene who said the problem with magicians is they stop thinking too soon?
Too soon?
No, I think it was Di Vernon said that.
Vernon.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're just proving the opposite of that. If you just keep thinking about it and evolving it, amazing things can happen.
I mean, people ask me, because my show, I'm doing the same tricks basically as I have done the past 20 years. And people talk about, how do you keep it fresh? And that's part of it, is I'm still thinking about ways to make it hopefully better.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Pat Proft who wrote some of the, very funny movies of the 70s and 80s. And he said something that always stuck with me: 90% of being funny is having a good memory and just being able to reach up and grab something off the shelf that fits here all of a sudden.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah. I don't remember which of the guys, but Penn Jillette tells this story about hanging out with Fire Sign Theater guys.
Oh, wow.
When Penn was a teen, stalking them, really, asking them, what's the secret to comedy? And one of the guys said, know everything.
Mm.
And it's sort of the same, right? You got something, you have all these things to pull from when the occasion arises.
One of the things I've heard you mention in the past, and I think the Cards Across...
I'll probably disavow this now.
Well, we'll see.
Okay,
We'll see. The Cards Across Cloak of Invisibility is, like much of your act, are routines that shouldn't really play to a larger room because there are smaller things, yet somehow you have made them so they do play to a larger room. And the Cloak of Invisibility being a classic example of that, because the audience can't see the cards. They're going to see you, and they're going to see the reactions of the two people.
That's one of the ones that plays the biggest, really, of all the tricks. I mean, my act is like, I think I've said exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, my act is really a close-up magic show that I do for, hundreds of people at a time. And the cloak is actually big because it's, it doesn't matter what the cards are. They're just objects, and you see people counting and you hear counting. And so that one's one of the easier ones to make visible or, play for a larger group. But some of the other stuff, hard to pocket, where it does matter what the card is, right? It's a signed playing card, and it's only that big.
Yeah.
But and so for but I've done it for like literally 10,000 live people without video magnification, and it seemed to play okay. I threw in a couple extra jokes that, I'm sure for those of you way back there, these are not stamps, they're actual playing cards, but they're not postage stamps, they're playing cards. But so that kind of made me think, you can do these things, smaller things for bigger people, just depending on your blocking, and also, moving your feet in a different way. There's just so many little things that you can do. But the main thing to me is every trick I do, except for the first one, there's 2 in the show, 10 minutes out of 70, there are 10 minutes where there's not somebody from the audience on stage with. And so that's to me, that's the big key for making something smaller play larger. And the key to that is picking the right people from the audience. So I have a 5-minute bit at the beginning where I'm just doing the rope trick. And I've done that so many times that I don't have to look at my hands or the rope to do that, really. I can watch the audience and observe how people are reacting to this trick and hopefully pick the right people. I picked most of the people that I'm going to use later in the show during that first 5 minutes.
Wow.
And so I'm kind of making mental notes. And it's because of the show, I kind of work backwards. For the last trick, I have to have a man who's wearing a watch with an expressive face. And I like to pick a man who's with what seems to be a date or his wife or his family, because he needs to be also cooperative. I want him to play along with some things. And so I feel like a guy with a bunch of other guys might try to show off and steal the show a little bit, which I don't want. I don't mind somebody who's difficult. I like that. And the audience likes that too, watching you overcome. But so I picked, and he also needs to be on my left, that ideally, for some angles of things, magic trick wise. So I picked him first because he has the most, sort of criteria that I have to sort. Then I picked the first woman who's going to come up, and I'm really looking for, somebody with open body language and an expressive face, and not necessarily, or almost certainly not actually, the most attractive woman in the room. Attractive is fine, but I don't want like modelly, slinky dress, and because first of all, it seems like a plant. More like a plant, but also I don't want for that to be what people are thinking about. And also I have a bit where I say we're going to do the Houdini challenge naked rope escape. I want you to take off your clothes and tie me up. That's the goofy little joke. And if it's with a woman who kind of leads with her sexuality, that joke plays way different than somebody else. So she's the next person I pick. So, and I'm looking for somebody to react big, right? So when her card appears, it's not just that the card appears, but that she acknowledges large enough, that her reaction is large enough to play for a bunch of people. That's a really long answer to your question, but
no, that's a master class is what that is.
Oh my God. I'm just fascinated by that. And so, and the thing for me here is you're performing something and taking mental notes while your body and your mouth is performing a piece of magic. You're looking at the audience going, there's my guy. There's the woman I'm going to use. Here's a kid that I use later.
It's sort of like doing ventriloquism, right? It's, there's this dialogue, and there's also the secret or whatever the operation of the puppet that's sort of covert. All these little things happening at the same time. That's another thing that keeps it sort of fresh for me is, I don't feel like I can just walk through it and do the show that I want to do, get the reaction I want to get.
They tell us you got to be present during these things, and you can sometimes see a performer who's kind of, they've turned it off and they're just going through the motions. But not only are you present and right there, but you are also 4 or 5 moves ahead while you're right there.
Right. Well, that's right too. Yeah. There's also, yeah. Oh, something will happen and you'll go, oh, you know what? If I refer to that 10 minutes from now, there's this bit that I know where that will fit in.
Yeah.
10 minutes from now, that's going to get a good reaction. Just having that in my back pocket for 10 minutes from now, call back.
See, I mean, that's the part about, I think, performing that talent always recognizes genius. And that's the part about what you're doing that is so genius that even a guy who does a fair amount of performing, not necessarily magic, but I'm shocked by the level of things that are going on while you're working. Taking a joke and put it in your back pocket for 10 minutes later, picking 3 audience members, you're making the ropes come apart and cutting them. And all of that is happening at the same time. To me, that's like, wow, what a mind-blowing concept to think about as a performer, to try to be that layered in what you're doing. That's incredible to me.
Well, but it doesn't start there, right? I mean, with something new, like with something brand new, for me anyway, all I can think about is getting through it safely, right? Without exposing the trick, right?
Yes.
So I have that. I've always felt like I've had that advantage in that I've always done a lot of shows. When I was, in my late teens, I worked with Lance Burton. We did these amusement parks three years in a row, and doing 3 shows a day, 7 days a week, sometimes as many as 5 or 6 on the weekends, depending on the crowd, how busy the park was. And, so that's, at least 21 shows a week. And he and I did that together for 3 years. And then I did it by myself after that, after he became quite famous.
Well, he told us, he said, people saw me on the Tonight Show for the first time and they thought I came out of nowhere. And he said, the stuff I did on the Tonight Show, I added them up. I've done that more than 1,000 times.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And, I don't want to kiss his ass too much, but I mean, to me, he's the greatest magician of my generation. And that act, there's no equal to that 12-minute bit. And I was lucky enough to be there for all, almost all of the sort of creation of a lot of that bit. I mean, it all evolved over time, but the bones of that were there at Tombstone Junction. That's where he hammered that out. It was a beautiful. So I was lucky to be right there at the forefront. The initial comedy club boom of the 80s and 90s, and so I was. After a couple of years of that, starting in I got out of college in 81, did Tombstone Junction for another couple of years after that, I think. Then comedy clubs. And by 85, I was a middle act in those clubs and starting to headline some of those places. And by the end of the 80s, I was headlining across the country. And so I was doing 45 minutes to 55 minutes, 7 to 10 times a week at that point, and I was just working all the time. And I went from that to Harrah's here in Las Vegas, and that was 10 shows a week for 22 years. And so I've always had a great laboratory, right? So if I'm working on something, and to me, all it is feedback and being a good listener. I'm listening to the audience and trying to see what they like, and I have the advantage. I'm going to come back I'm going to come back in an hour, or I'm going to come back tomorrow, and I can implement this tiny little change or this big giant change if it's warranted, to see if I can't make that trick better and better and better.
It's John Carney talked about sanding things rather than hammering at them. Refining.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's still a place for hammering. I mean,
sure.
Me, that's early on, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in my office and right now, and so I mean, there's right there. There's 2 tricks that I'm working on. Actually, 3 tricks. One I'm really quite stymied on, and one I'm really working harder on. But anyway, they're sitting there for me to think about them. And my daughter, thankfully, had some friends. And so anytime I was working on a new trick, when people would come over to visit my daughter, her friends would come over and she's like, who wants to watch my dad do a trick? But that's when the hammering took place, right?
Yeah, right.
Here at my house, as opposed to on stage. All that beating it with a sledgehammer happened either in my head or doing it for my friends or family.
So after having done it for so long, what it is at the core of the Cloak of Invisibility? What is it about that routine that audiences love?
I don't know. That's a good question. The first thing that pops in my head when you ask me that is, I think they love sort of participating in the joke. He knows he's not invisible. We know he's not invisible, but it's sure fun to pretend like he thinks he's invisible, and we can think he's invisible. We can pretend to think he's invisible. And so I think it appeals to the sort of the element of play in people.
It sort of reminds me of one of those tricks where you take one audience member and you create one reality for him, and the rest of the audience knows exactly what's going on.
Yeah, right.
And that person, and the audiences love that. And you've sort of turned that so that you're the idiot who doesn't know what's going on, and they're all in on the joke.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's exactly perfect. Yeah, sort of like paper balls over the head, that trick, or the powers of darkness, the Corinda thing with the rings. Sure. Yeah, I'm the butt of the joke. I'm a complete idiot.
I think one of the things that I always mention when I tell people you got to go see Matt King if you're going to Vegas is the comedy is so good that unless you have an affinity for magic like I do, you don't get credit for how good your magic is, because your comedy is so funny that unless you're sort of in on that's an incredible Cards Across. That's an incredible. The things he's doing magically are astounding, but if you're just a layperson, you're laughing so hard you have no concept of all the other things you're doing. Like even me, a performer, had no idea you're doing a rope trick and you're then cataloging the audience and filing things away.
Yeah, I mean, and what you said there made me think too about the Cloak of Invisibility, and what's going on with the audience. There's also, and this is something I try to do with every trick, but there's also, there's this element of silliness and this element of stupidity, sort of. I'm tiptoeing around the stage in a yellow poncho, claiming to be invisible. And yet, at the end, it's hard to say whether the ending is stronger because that bit is so stupid. But I mean, that's a big magic payoff, right? And I think it's sort of surprising to the audience that it does, in fact, pay off. That's strong.
You just don't see it coming because it's so powerful.
Magicians do. I mean, they know. Cards Across, right?
That's my point.
But I think if you're not familiar with that plot, then the fact that it did in fact happen in there is a really satisfying for the audience payoff.
Agreed.
To the silliness.
Yeah.
Who was it who said the problem with comedy magic is that it's usually neither?
Right. Yeah. I think Penn said that.
Yeah.
And you're firing on all cylinders when it comes to both sides of that equation. And I think
I'm really trying. I mean, I've always, I've had friends. I mean, Penn is one of them. Penn, how much more famous you would be if you dropped the magic.
Oh.
And I'm like, and Jay Leno, I've opened for Jay a number of times, and he's always been like, you're too funny for this magic stuff. You should stop doing magic and just do stand-up. You're too funny for that.
You ever consider that?
Yeah, but I'm not a stand-up comedian. I mean, I like stand-up comedy, and there's some element to stand-up comedy in my act. But what I really love is being a magician. And so it seems, I don't know why I would get, I'm not in it for the fame. And I don't, those guys are very nice about, your career would be more successful if you did it this way. But I love being a magician, and I'm not in it for the fame. It's just the money.
It's that old Bill Murray quote. If you want to be rich and famous, try being rich first and see if that just doesn't do it.
No, I'm in it because I love being a magician. I mean, I've been interested in magic since I was a little boy, and it's still my hobby too, in addition to my profession. I like reading magic books about stuff that I will never do because I like how magicians think, and I like reading about it, thinking about how they think.
Teller with Michael Callahan.
One thing I'm sure to say in the introduction, but I'm going to say it here again now for our listeners. The idea behind this conversation is to look at the value and importance of mentorship, both for the mentor and the mentee.
Stop right there. Stop right there. The word mentee needs to be eliminated from our vocabulary.
Does it really?
Okay. Yes, it does. Mentor was a character in the Odyssey. He's an old family friend of Odysseus's family. Odysseus entrusted his son Telemachus to mentor's care and instruction. So if you want to call somebody the corresponding thing to mentor, that is the person who is being mentored, you can refer to that person as a Telemachus.
I'm writing this down.
Please do.
Telemachus?
It is absolutely offensive to me as an old Latinist to hear the number of times that I hear mentee, which just makes me think of some kind of beverage. I won't have
4 mentees and a fried chicken, please.
Yes, I won't have it. It sounds like a cocktail.
All right. Please forgive me. I had no idea that I would be able to offend within my first 2 sentences.
Yes. That's because I'm particularly offendable on that particular one point. The rest of the time, I'm just a golden, easygoing guy. But comes to misuse of classical terms, I won't have it.
Well, then I will just go so far as to say this is a conversation about mentors and the people they mentor.
Yes.
And it's not meant to be a blueprint for how to get Teller to be your mentor.
Oh, good.
If that's the listener's idea, disabuse yourself of that right now. Thank you both for being here. Teller, you've been so kind to me with my Eli Marks books and letting me use that quote for the Linking Rings book. Michael, I got to see you twice at Sunday Night Magic. And both times you did really, they were works in progress, but they were really, really good works in progress. And as I mentioned to you before, when I saw them and I told you, I said, you think like Penn and Teller. And you said that is the highest praise. So to have you both together to talk about how your relationship came together and how it works and how you both benefit from it, I think is really important for our podcast, because we've talked to Jim, I think 60 magicians so far, somewhere in that nape of the neck.
Right.
Yeah. And the concept of having a mentor has come up several times. I know when we talked to John Carney, he talked a lot about Fawcett Ross and about Di Vernon. Steve Spill, all Steve Spill talked about was Di Vernon and how he helped him. Suzanne has talked to us about that. Tyler Erickson talked to us about that. In fact, we just had Bill Arnold on, and Bill, who is not really a podcast guy, came on. One of the reasons he wanted to come on was to talk about the 2 mentors who were so very important to him. So it's something we've touched on, but we've never had the chance to have both people in the room at the same time to talk about what it meant to them. So with that in mind, let me just jump in and start with you, Michael. What was your situation when you reached out to Teller for the first time?
Yeah, quickly, thank you so much for having me, John, and what an absolute honor. And I haven't actually said hi to Teller yet on air. So hi, Teller, how are you?
Hello, I'm fine. I'm back from the dead.
Oh, yes.
And I don't know if it'll make the final edit, but I absolutely adore that we managed to prompt Teller to get a quintessential moment out of him there with regarding to the mentor-mentee. It's like, well, that's the friend I know, so you guys can turn off the video now. And I'm very honored to be here, and I hope to be able to share, not just give you answers, and talk about mentorship, menteeship, not just talk about it, but with the understanding that I've been placed in this amazing position where 99% of the time that Teller and I have spent together has been one-on-one, and he has been very generous with both my family, my wife, and my daughters. And we have had other people around, but in many ways, I feel like a living secret notebook. And it's just such an honor to be able to share a little bit of my perspective as to who I see him to be, which is quite honestly the best magician of the generation, and I would make the case the last 100 years. I know that I have a bit of a bias on that, but I would make that argument in good case. So when I got into magic, I got into magic because of seeing Penn and Teller. I grew up in a small town, 3 hours from Denver, 5 hours from Omaha, and my only access point was my public library as far as a few books. And I had a lot of interests, and magic was always one of them, and I would cycle through it. But unlike Teller, who magic was a constant touchstone in his childhood, for me, it was something that I just bounced off of occasionally, didn't have a lot of access to on a very high level, which was why his book, Cruel Tricks for Dear Friends, was so important, because I knew that I was looking, even though it was available to me through B. Dalton Books at the mall when I would be taken up to go school shopping in the fall, and I brought it home. I knew I was looking at something I had never seen in any of the magic books I'd found in my libraries, whether it was the Scarney book or the Blackstone book or any of those generally available books. And so here was this insight into the cutting edge of culture, obviously written by two very smart people. It was magic, which I loved, and I had never seen magic in a way that it had removed all of the negative cliches that I had grown up understanding magic to me. I mean, I remember seeing Copperfield vanish the Statue of Liberty on television, and it was neat. We watched it, but it didn't move me. And so years later, I was in college and I hadn't done a magic trick in years, and I was just struggling away in engineering school, and Penn and Teller were going to play in Fort Collins. I heard it on the radio, and so on a whim, I got a hold of my girlfriend, my wife now, and I said, I think we should try to go get tickets up there. And so it was completely sold out. So our only chance was to go and try to get season ticket holder releases. They would release the people who hadn't called in to claim them. So we ended up in the mezzanine, right in the middle of the theater. And my folks had done a good job of making sure I had seen Les Mis. Amazingly, they had taken me to even Tron on Ice. So my cultural sensibilities were quite broad. And when we saw the Penn and Teller show, I had never seen anything like it. I hadn't felt those feelings. I had never laughed that hard. I'd seen a lot of stuff, but nothing had changed my life. And that changed my life. And I just knew I wanted to do this in some way, not knowing what that meant, where to begin. And so that was like 1995-ish. And then just to put a timeline on this, Teller and I met. I approached him with the intention of saying hello in 2012. So we're talking quite a few many years later. I had developed a show that at that point was allowing me to work professionally. I had done 3 years in the comedy clubs, not expecting to become a comic. So when I was getting paid to do comedy, that surprised me. But I was dovetailing what I was learning in the comedy clubs, pairing that with these 4 mentalism tricks that I had gotten very good at, including I do think that my Out of This World is one of the best ones out there. So I dovetailed these 4 mentalism tricks in with what I was building in the comedy clubs, and I had a working hour, and I met him. I had made something that I thought I could sell on the market, and I worked very hard on the marketing. And my wife and I waited after the show because we knew they would come out, because they always come out, because if they are nothing, they are consistent and dedicated. And so we waited and it got to the point where we even saw Teller look over at us as though we could move forward, and we didn't. We hung back and we hung back and we hung back. And finally I walked up to him and I opened the market. The way I had packaged this little deck, I made a very elaborate die cut pop-up version of the logo. And so I wanted to wow him. So I opened the little marketing thing, and I said, this is an example of my work. It's largely inspired by the ideas you wrote about in your House of Mystery series with Todd Carr. And then I gave him the letter that accompanied it, which again was my dear wife's idea. She said, you're never going to be able to say what you want to say to him in the moment, so why don't you write him a letter? So I wrote him that letter. It was about 5 or 6 paragraphs, and I worked very hard on it. And I knew that even though I'd worked hard on it, there was going to be typos in there, because I am a typo machine and it cannot be defeated. And so he was so kind, as always. He thanked me. He remembered that the water tank had a leak that night, and he received my gift. said goodnight, and Erin and I were walking down the hall, and she said to me, how do you feel? And I said, well, I feel a little bit silly. I mean, you know, I feel a little silly. It's a little silly, but I also know that he's going to read that letter, and I know that he will have heard what I have to say, and so I'm really happy about that. And we were driving on the way home. We had the babysitter at home, and we were driving, and I saw all of a sudden that I had a voicemail from a Las Vegas number, and I thought this can't be, and so I listened to the voicemail, and it was Teller, and so I called him right back. And he picked up and he said, hello, Michael. And I said, hello, Teller. He said, I suppose you're driving home. And I said, I am, but I will happily turn around. And he said, no, you don't have to. You don't have to turn around. I just wanted to check and see where you were at. He said, I read your letter, and I thought I would give you a call. And I said, I said, I tell you what, I'll email you tomorrow. And I said,
is that the deck that he's holding up right now?
Yeah, there it is. Holy cow. Oh my gosh. There it is.
You can tell instantly from the way this is put together that this is being done by somebody who profoundly cares about what he does and is willing to go to any lengths to make it perfect. You know, it really did quite blow me away, and it's really cleverly done.
We'll let Teller talk much more. I will wrap up my intro here. So the next day, we hung up the phone, and my wife and I screamed in the car for an hour straight, heading down Highway 169 South. She and I were both such tremendous fans, and we had followed them wherever they had performed, and you know they didn't know they were important to our lives, but they were very important to our lives, as great artists are. And the next day, I kept picking up my phone and looking, and then finally this email pops in. And it was from the magician Teller, and he said, thanks so much for the great gift, the kind note. I think we should be friends. And I think we screamed for a minute again, and then and immediately I thought, I have no idea what that means. Like, what does that mean? We should be friends. Does this mean this is the most ellipses friends on the, but I'm up for anything, whatever that means. This is great. And so that was, I guess, 11 years ago. And it's just been an absolute honor and a pleasure to have him be a friend and at times step in as a mentor and say he's my mentor and say he's my friend. And it's been one of the great honors of my life.
Yeah, no doubt. What a great story that is. What a fantastic, the chutzpah there. I appreciate that kind of behavior, Michael, and apparently so does Teller. Teller, do you remember your reaction to his letter and his trick? Do you get those kinds of things handed to you on a regular basis?
I'll often get letters handed to me or passed to me backstage. And they're usually, they're not usually from magicians. They're usually from lay people who are just enthusiasts. And I try to respond as best I can to pretty much all of them. And I do, you know, that means sometimes just saying, hey, give me a photo. Let me autograph it and send it off to this person. Sometimes I don't get around to it. I confess, because there's a lot of stuff. I'm a busy guy.
Yeah,
this was quite an extraordinary calling card. I mean, you have to love magic props, right? If you're in magic, you have to love magic props. And when you see one into which so much thought has gone and so much precision of execution has gone, you say, this is a person to take seriously. And that's exactly what I did. You know, it's always having more friends who are smart and good is always a good thing. So it doesn't. I think I have zero of the I'm in show business, so I'm a big deal. I think that's just zero in me. There's no portion of that. The closest I come to that is, you know, like if I'm at Disneyland and somebody comes up and says, "Can I get a picture with you?" I'll go, sure. And that sort of makes me feel like I'm a showbiz big shot. But I don't have any of the, you know, I have never had a bodyguard. You know, I've never tried to keep hoi polloi. Note I say hoi polloi and not the hoi polloi, which is redundant. I don't keep hoi polloi. Hoi polloi means the people. Hoi is the, polloi is people. hoi polloi. I don't try to keep hoi polloi away from me. Because there's too much benefit. There's too much benefit to having more friends. When I go, I mean, for example, if I'm in Leeds, England, I have a family there that I've kept in touch with for some years, and they are, they'll say, come have a meal with us. And when you're in Leeds, you want a family that's going to do that, right? What else are you going to do in Leeds? So that's very nice. But it's very, very nice to have people in your acquaintance who are striving to do new ideas, because we're striving to do new ideas all the time. And and new ideas are when someone else's new idea, even if you're not copying it, can be very inspiring. In fact, there's Michael gave us one idea of his that we haven't yet used, that believe me, is still in the back of our minds with the lawnmower. I would, that's still a possibility for the future in some season when we're not already overburdened with card tricks.
To follow up on that, Teller, I wanted to pitch to you that there's the price of an electric lawnmower has come down substantially since you expressed interest in that.
Yeah, it's just a beautiful, funny big idea. I think we are all set for this season with 21, God help us, new pieces for Fool Us. 7 or 8 of them are now in the show live, and it's a bit insane for our crew, because our crew comes in and says, okay, what's new today? How do we rearrange the entire show? And anyway, this is all skipping the mentor question. Apart from Michael, I haven't had a lot of people that I consider myself mentor to, except maybe Brian Brushwood, and he's worth your talking to, because Brian Brushwood came to our show when he was I'll make the guess 16 with his mother, and they came to the show and they made a joke to me afterwards. They said his mother said he doesn't know it, but he's actually your bastard son. And I went, oh, I have a bastard son. That's wonderful. And I talked with him a little bit more and just heard in his voice the absolute passion for being a performer. And I began to correspond with him. And if you look up, Brian Brushwood's website, you'll see a ton of our correspondence. And we've kept it. What thrills me about this is that I think that there are people who say, I really, really like magic, but nobody could ever actually make a living that way. Well, it depends on what kind of living you want. It's if you want a big paycheck tomorrow afternoon, good luck. But if you want to be like Penn and Teller, that is to say, living hand to mouth for 10 years before anybody pays any attention to you at all, because you love what you're doing so much, then you got a chance. And Brushwood just kept at it, and now he has this whole sort of little empire in Texas. It's he has a recording studio. He does a podcast. His magic has gone from just performance at colleges to other kinds of things. He's a very interesting guy. But that's energy in human beings and intelligence in human beings and daring and originality in human beings, coupled with good manners, always interests me.
Good manners being key, I think, just about anywhere across the board.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about first times with people, Teller, the first time I saw you and Penn live was at the State Theater in Minneapolis. I'd been sent there by my client, International Dairy Queen, because they wanted to hire you guys to close out their annual meeting. And I believe someone along the line had said, well, you can see their show, and if it works in their schedule, they might they might do it, but they're only going to do their show. And so I went to the show and came back, and the client said, are they good? And I said, they're fantastic. Well, are people like them? I said, well, they end the show naked, covered in blood. Are you okay with that? As it turned out, they weren't okay with that, and I sort of knew they weren't okay with that, but it was fun being able to say it to them. Michael, from your side, what form has the mentorship taken? How does it work, and how do you How you benefited?
I will say right out of the gate, the very beginning, Teller had such an understanding of he had such an empathetic understanding of what it must be like to be me and in this position. And every time he's ever sensed that I was a little bit shell-shocked, he's always taken the wheel and stepped in, and that's been when we've been in person together, over the phone. I still, when we talk on the phone, 11 years later, I pace for hours before, and I will lose my breath. I'm so excited, and I just run at him with endless banter and nervous giggles, and the only time I've begged him to be more critical of my work and my thoughts, and the closest I've ever come to getting a rebuff was one time he just did have to say, I just wouldn't stop talking. He said, I need you to stop talking, I'm thinking. That was the closest I ever came to any kind of a rebuff. But he said to me right out of the gate, because I asked him, I said, I don't know what this means. I don't know what form this is going to take. And he said, well, we're going to take it slow. Neither of us are going anywhere, and we will email, and sometimes we will talk on the phone, and sometimes we will get together, and we're going to take it slow. And that's exactly what it's been. It has just been this unbelievably paced relationship. And along the way, I've been witness to, first off, his professionalism. He has always answered every time I've called or emailed. And that just astounds me, knowing how busy he is. He is, speaking of the listening story, he is such a sincere listener. He will listen, and he will think, and then he will share the best of himself with you, his ideas in the moment. God, he is so patient. From that first email letting me know, this whole thing is a long haul. This doesn't happen in the next 48 hours. And so he's been so patient with me. I've wanted to model, I've worked to model after him his ability to extend trust. That's just been something that I've been in awe of in our 11 years is the opportunities and position he's put me in a trusted position that I have, as he mentioned, the good manners. I've worked very hard and consciously not ever to abuse or misstep. And he's put me in some incredibly big spots, and I'm so I want to be as trusting as he is. It's a wonderful thing. As you can imagine, I highly curated my first probably 12 months with him. I was very, very nervous to ever say that maybe I'd had a bad show, that maybe I wasn't feeling nothing but flowers and roses and bunnies about magic at the time. And so I was very, very, I did put on my best face with him. And I remember the first time I was driving in an extended drive, and we were on the phone, and I shared with him that I was frustrated, and I was deeply frustrated, and I was having feelings of inadequacy. and it was one of the both longest and most important conversations in my life. And just his understanding, his empathy. I mean, I had said things in the past where this didn't happen. He's like, oh, you think that was bad? Listen to this. And nobody has better road stories. Nobody has better showbiz stories than Teller. So if you think you're going to tell a showbiz story, understand you are the opening act. But in this conversation, he's just such a great human. And then that's why I was so excited about getting asked to do this, is because I know when I'm talking, Teller's not talking, and people want to hear Teller, but I hope people understand that my talking is Teller talking through me in this experience. That he has always made time for me. There was a time when he had said that he would be able to meet up with me. I was in Las Vegas for one thing, and I had let him know, and the man got off an airplane, fought his way to his office, met with me for an hour, drove me back to the hotel, and in doing so, nearly missed his next meeting. None of that needed to happen, but he was so keen to honor his commitment to me. Again, just where is that mentorship or is that friendship? It's both. It's absolutely both. We have two words for a reason. They both have their place, but so often when we're together, you don't know. It's just both.
I don't think of you as a Telemachus. No, I really don't. I think of you as somebody who is at a different part of your career from where I am right now, and you're moving forward, and you're moving forward in the struggling way that anybody who actually is good is ever going to do, which is to have failure after failure after failure, and then go, oh yeah, let's go this way.
So to that point, Teller, I think that the benefit part of that question, when I met him, I had mentioned that I was doing a mentalism act. And that was where I was, only with him just being, I knew him only through his work and through his writing. And it might have been the night of, I think it might have been the first conversation that night when he emailed me the hour before his show. And he said to me, we just met, but I can tell that you care deeply enough magic. I don't think you should pigeonhole yourself as a mentalist. That was it, one sentence. So often when you get a chance to be with Teller, listen to the sentence, because it's so much, it will not be a paragraph. The thing that you need to come away with will be a perfectly crafted sentence. And so here I sit 11 years later, and I'm very proud to say, and I don't even know if he knows this, but this January, I was asked to headline a comedy club, not a magic show. I do a lot of private magic shows, but I was asked to headline a comedy club on the weekend in the heart of the season, the Minnesota comedy season, which is the dead of winter. And the booker knew full well that I was a magician. And I stood on that stage. I did 70 minutes of magic in a comedy club. Only because it's a detail of the story is that it went very well, and the booker and the club owner was thrilled and was saying, you need to be doing this in more comedy clubs. And the important note, though, is I was telling this to my wife Erin, is that we realized, she came to Saturday night, and we realized there was not a single thing that I said or did that I was saying or doing when I met him. And I had gone from a mentalist who had built things to say in a comedy club, and I was now a magician who was compelling and getting the laughs and doing the work that you need to do to be entertaining on stage in that environment. And your work just creeps along at such a slow pace that it's hard to realize you're making progress at times. And for me, it was one of those really nice mileposts where I realized, yeah, I mean, what changed? Well, I had this crazy thing where Teller and I, he stepped into my life and I stepped into his. And I also want to add that as far as trying to understand that, I floated that to him one time. I was like, I don't get this. And he said, one sentence. I said one sentence. Sometimes the door opens, period. End of email. That was it. And it was like, okay, I will never, that's enough for me. That's exactly right. And so, when I was thinking about having this conversation on this podcast, I'm like, I'm not going to try to explain some of this. I just need to tell stories so people can understand who and see him the way I see him and understand him the way I see him, and know that sometimes the door just opens, period. One sentence, pay attention.
It makes sense that someone who makes his living on stage not talking, and that when he does talk, A, you should listen, and B, every word's going to have some meaning behind it.
Or I get more credit than I should, right? Because when I don't talk on stage, people start to think of me the way they would think of their pet cat. So if their pet cat comes out with one single lucid, complete sentence, it's like a miracle.
So, Teller, what have you gotten from your side of this relationship? How do you benefit from it?
How can I say? I enjoy. How at a magic convention, little groups of magicians will stay up all night together talking about stuff. And that's a cauldron of ideas. That's a place where your new ideas get started. It's also just pleasurable, and also Michael is an amazing chef. Yeah, I have had some of the finest food of my life at his house. Believe me, I mean, he's a multi-talented guy, which is also extraordinary for magicians, right? Because magicians usually, the best they can do is their little card trick. He's an actual professional painter of very high quality. And that's something I wonder if that's going to feed into the performance sometime in the not too distant future. There might be it seems like it's dying to come through somehow, and it's an angle that could be very rich. Hi. So I guess my answer is, what do you get from having a friend that's interesting to talk to? That's what we get.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Do you think that your background in teaching might make you a little better of a mentor just because you understand where a student is coming from?
I wasn't a very good teacher, so I had no teaching education. So the only thing I could do really was identify the more interesting students and spend extra time with them, and that I did. That I did, and I ended up making friends of students subsequently. That I'm still friends with today. In some cases, not all cases. I really don't know. I mean, there's a theatrical aspect to teaching that has to do with knowing how to stage and express an idea so that it comes across. And I'm sure that informs my work, but I think it's more like my work would inform the teaching than the other way around. Because I'm fairly good at stripping stuff down and saying, what's the essence of this, and putting things in sequence. Probably my best single quality as a for want of a better word, composer of magic tricks, is that I really do know a little bit about how to hold back information and release it at the proper time. The unfolding of a story is very much about that. It's very much about saying, okay, what's the real picture here? Now, how can we make the discovery of that picture into a story?
Yeah.
And so that's something that's always that always pervades my work, but also should not necessarily pervade somebody else's work. I mean, when you're looking at somebody else's work, you need to find out what they're up to. That what they're up to is what's important. It's what's wrong with so much of what's so-called criticism. Critics who write for newspapers about shows. They write down what they would have wanted there, and then say, oh well, they did a lot of that and they didn't do a lot of that. Well, that's not really what a critic does. A critic is from the root word that means to discern, to understand, to clarify. So real critics try to figure out what's going on and then articulate it. And I think I may have a little bit of that in me. That's helpful to me when working even with actors, because what you hire an actor to do a role, you see the way you would do it yourself, but that's not pertinent. What you need to do is find out what the actor wants to do with that role and make that work into the story.
Yeah.
Can we talk just a little bit then, Teller, about personally, were there mentors in your life?
Yes.
That helped to shape your outlook on magic or life in general, I guess?
Yes, there were. Well, there was several of them. Both of my parents are very important in this. I think my mother for her absolute frankness, my father for teaching me this. This is perhaps the biggest mentorship lesson of anything I ever had in my life. And Michael knows this because I wrote about it, and When I'm Dead, All This Will Be Yours. But my father was a commercial artist. He did lettering designs for advertisements, and he didn't do very well, but he had one very good year. And during that year, he took us on a cross-country trip, and he bought 16 acres of wasteland in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And he said, we should build a cabin on that wasteland. And I said, how do you do that? He said, I'll show you. And he sent away for books from the federal government about how to build a cabin, brought them in, read them with me. Then he said, how big do we want the cabin? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, we don't want to waste a lot of wood. Let's figure it out. So on our kitchen floor, we taped out a floor plan of the cabin. And we said, well, it has to be this high, at least for you to get in the door. And, we should have ways to close the windows so that, when the wind comes, we can protect ourselves. And then with a series of pieces of yellow paper, he drew out, while telling me that I was doing it too. I don't think I actually was, but he said, let's draw this out together. Okay, so you say that the cabin should be 9 feet wide and 12 feet long. All right, where will the bunks be? We put them in there. And we took step by step by step on this thin yellow paper to render finally a drawing of the cabin. And then he said, well, how much lumber are we going to need? I said, well, how do we figure that out? He said, well, here's the dimensions that lumber comes. So how many boards are we going to need? So we sat there and we calculated out how many boards, how many nails, how many everything. So that I got to see as a child that you could get an idea and have no thing there for it except your idea, draw it, plan it, order materials, and then we went and we built it. We stole some pieces of old telephone pole that were lying along the highway near the property. We dug holes for them. We sunk them into the ground. When I say we, I mean, of course it's my father doing this. I'm 8 years old at the time, but at the same time, to me, I was doing that. And then he said, well, we got to level this thing. So we got strings and levels and level the base of this little house. And over the course of many, many weekends coming up to Bucks County from Philadelphia, we built the damn cabin. I don't think anything in my life has been a more important piece of mentorship than that, because I got to see how you get an idea and bring it to completion. Then, in addition to that, there was a completely different kind of mentorship from, I was the Telemachus of that. Of my high school English teacher and drama coach, David G. Rosenbaum, aka Rosie, aka David Glenn, aka D. Glenn Ross. When he would write articles for Magic magazines, it would be under the name D. Glenn Ross. And David Glenn was his performing name. He was a dreamer. So he where my father's very concrete. Let's get this. Rosenbaum was a dreamer, but he was a dreamer with a lot of understanding of drama and particularly acting. And he's the one who completely, absolutely anything that I know about movement on stage, I mean, all the stuff that you see me do very naturally, that Penn does kind of weirdly. Like, if I'm on stage, I will not be blocking some other piece of action on stage, and Penn will be standing like this. But he didn't have Rosie there. Rosie taught me all of these classical things. I mean, for example, I'm going to tilt my screen down here. I know that the readers, the listeners can't see the screen, but Rosie taught me things like, when you're going to sit down, you bring your leg on stage, you bring your leg up against the chair, feel the chair in place, lower yourself to the seat of the chair, and then slide back. He taught me how to go up and down stairs on stage. He taught me really all of those things. But in addition to that, he really thought about dramatic structure in a way that very few people do. Certainly people like Henning Nelms never think about real dramatic structure. They think about mechanical structure. They say, oh, the audience will be very excited if you have 15 scantily clad young girls and they all move in unison. Rosie was not about that. He was about how the ideas develop into stories. Particularly, let me think of a particular example. I believe that most of what I always preach about cause and effect is stuff that I learned from Rosie. What I always preach is, let's say you take a sponge ball and you place it in your hand and then you show your hand empty, that's not a trick. That's not a trick. That's not a trick until there's a cause. You place the sponge ball in your hand, then you take a wand and you strike it with the wand. Oh my goodness gracious! Oh, what's happened to that? Now the sponge ball has vanished as opposed to just not being there. There's a little cause and effect are really the poetry of magic, and where you may see that most clearly, I guess, is in my shadow trick, where by cutting a shadow, the real object withers and dies. And when we see magic that doesn't have causality, even doesn't have the tiniest touch of causality, we don't feel about it the same way that we feel about other stuff, other really good magic. So, that's the kind of thing that Rosie taught me. Those are my two principal mentors. There's one other that I think never knew he was a mentor and never thought it was, never considered the possibility that it was connected with magic, and that is Peter Westergaard, who was my college music theory teacher. And Peter Westergaard had a whole way of analyzing the line of a melody that allowed you to understand what the listener was expecting at any given moment, and then what the outcome was for the listener. And in good melodies, there's always surprises in that. And all of the stuff that he taught me there has very much affected the things that I've thought since.
Teller, may I prompt you on one thing here, just a little bit more?
Yeah, sure.
One time you shared with me that you had an instructor who had you break down a section of Shakespeare, and the drill was to, in every line, think, what would the intelligent and sensitive reader be thinking right now?
Yeah, that was John Moore, my literature teacher at Amherst College. And John Moore, it is very striking that John Moore and the music teacher were both on the same page in some ways. John Moore did a wonderful assignment in the Odyssey. There's a moment where Odysseus is like a ragged beggar-looking guy, but he's back in his own house, and his own house is being abused by all of these unpleasant people who are trying to marry Odysseus's wife. And he's there, and he's going to kill them all, and we know he's going to kill them all. And there's the setup is, whoever can thread a bow and shoot an arrow through a whole bunch of axe handles is going to get to marry Odysseus's wife. And he's there, and he's playing the beggar, and they go, okay, all right, go ahead, take up the bow, see what you can do. And then there's this breathtakingly beautiful, incredibly suspenseful description of how he does it. You know, how he takes this big bow that none of the others can bend and just bends it calmly and picks it up like a musician, plucks the string of the bow like a musician, about to pluck the harp. And we know that he's just going to fucking kill them all, and by making us, the students there, go line by line and say, how do you react to this line? How do you react to that line? How do you react to that line? How do you react to that line? As you go through that sequence, you really understand what Homer accomplished, what Homer was accomplishing in terms of building this lovely suspense. So yeah, John Moore was that one particular exercise from John Moore did stick with me. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, you're welcome. And just one of the things, so I keep a list of in my phone of things that you've said, these sentences, and this whole time, everything you've talked about in the last few minutes, early up on that list, you said one time, I'm always thinking, what's next? What's next? And that sentence shows up in so many different ways. And it's actually shown up in so many different ways of everything you just talked about. So as far as a teller pearl of wisdom, what's next? What's next? What's next? What's next?
Yeah, it's a thing that magicians really need to do all the time. I mean, if you're making a movie, you know how people talk about movies. Oh, I knew that was coming. If they can say that, well, it's not much of a movie. Every little next step needs to be a little surprise. There needs to be a little spice there. But yes, I do really. When I was working on the Red Ball, that's probably the place where it's most visible. But on the Red Ball, I just kept saying, "What is the audience thinking right now, and how can we turn that? What are they thinking right now, and how can we turn that?"
The big lesson that I'm taking from your past mentors is that experience with your father in the cabin, because I think what I learned from that, which is something I've learned from my own experience in making low-budget feature-length movies, which are big, long, seemingly endless processes, is he was teaching you to get to an end you need to go through and figure out all the steps, and that it isn't a fast process. And if it is a fast process, it's probably not going to be correct. You have to have the willingness to take all those steps. And that clearly shows up in your work, where you will take years to perfect something. And that was ingrained from you as an 8-year-old, that there's a process and you're going to follow the process.
Yep. And at the same time, of course, I'm an impatient jerk. You know, all the time. Oh, that's a great idea. Let's put it on the stage. Well, you know, it'll be terrible. But sometimes the way to deal with that is just to say, this is a great idea. I don't want to go to all the trouble to work on it. So let's put it between two strong things in the show. Come into the not so good idea out of a strong thing, and go out into a strong thing, and then let there be a weak place there that you can fix. And maybe the urgency of the audience not liking it will make you fix it faster. Yeah. There's something in the show right now that's exactly like that.
Well, I think, Michael, a little bit of what you did when you performed twice at Sunday Night Magic was you did stuff and then you tested something in between to try it out on an audience. And I think it's both smart and brave to do that sort of thing. But how else are you going to do it unless you put it on its feet in some form?
In a certain way, you're not really testing it on the audience. You know, I think about the test screenings that they do of movies, where they'll show the movie. I've been involved in a number of these. They'll show it to the audience, and then they'll have the audience fill out little cards that say, I like this, I didn't like that. My experience of that is, tear those cards up, but remember what it was like to sit in the room with them. Yep. Because you will feel what's really going on in the room from just being there.
That's really all you need. So, Michael, you and I talked earlier about our mutual friend, Noah Sony. And when Noah was on a couple of years ago, he didn't specifically call you a mentor, but he gave you great credit because you gave him the one thing he needed in his life at that time, which was stage time. And he developed so much faster, I think, because you were able to give him that thing that he needed that he just wasn't finding anywhere else. So that's a form of mentorship, don't you think?
Oh, yes. And if he were to think of it in that way, I would be completely honored. Noah is, if there's one analog in the way that Teller and I have interacted in that friendship/mentorship way, if I have an analog for me, that would be my friend, Noah. Yeah. And again, you know, in the same way that my time with Teller came out of just the way that, I guess, Buckminster Fuller said, you know, the critical path, your life rides the knife's edge, and it is what it is. You know, he and I became friends in a very nonsensical manner. It just fell together. And when you meet somebody that you enjoy, it works out really well. Knowing that editing is a possibility, it's just remarkable to listen to Teller talk. And then, again, he has said things like, true precision develops over time. And I will tell a quick story. I was very lucky enough to spend a little bit of time backstage in an environment where there wasn't anybody. I was the only one who wasn't a part of the immediate team, and the team was smaller than normal based on where we were. And I had just seen the show, and I was lucky enough to be back there waiting my time to go grab something to eat. And I knew what the set list was that night. And as somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about their material for my own, trying to understand and think about it, dissect it myself, there was nothing in the show that was, as often as they perform, nothing that was what could be called new. There was stuff that was new-ish, but as far as pure number of reps, everything that I had seen that night had already gone on stage under live fire a lot. And I got the sense and the feel, you could just see it happen. This was something that happened every single night, which was each member of the team took their time checking in with Teller, checking in with Penn, and they did notes. And it astounded me because I know what they just did that night. And they weren't just doing notes on the new stuff. They were doing notes that I have known to be in their career for as long as I've known them. And that was jaw-dropping to watch. I don't know how to say it. I mean, you know, like we all try to get better. We all try to reflect on what we've done, but it was just another level of what they do as far as their attention to always how does this get better? How can we change this? It was amazing.
we're so lucky to have the crew that we have. I mean, many of them have been with us 20 or 30 years now, but some of them came in when they were 17 or 18, and they know that I don't. One of the luxuries of my life right now is I do not set or check a prop, not one. I do not set or check a prop. My expert team sets and checks the props. If there's something missing or wrong, they will know it with more pain than I could ever inflict on them, because they're so conscientious about that. And that's a great luxury. I mean, I think about Houdini and Jim. What was Jim Collins? Mm-hmm. You know, they're just finding the right people to be your colleagues in this is amazing. And sometimes they also can start out being okay and then suddenly become great. Well, they can get bad too, but several of our team this year, I've noticed, have gone from very good to, oh my goodness, you're my collaborator, you're not my servant. Mm-hmm. Really good.
And so, can I just ask a question about that process? Because I do get notes when I perform, but I one time I saw a guest speaker at a conference I was at who flew with the Blue Eagles, and he said after every flight performance by the Blue Eagles, there is a commander, obviously, who's in charge of that particular show. But when it's over, they all go into a room and their ranks come off, and anybody in that room who was part of that team can speak candidly and honestly in an effort to propel the whole thing to the next level. And no one's going to take offense, and no one's going to say, how dare you, or who do you think you are to give me a note? Is it that kind of a process, Teller?
Yeah, it is. Particularly our rehearsals, before we really learned how to use our crew, our rehearsals were somewhat compartmentalized. Now our rehearsals really are, okay, what are we going to do next? And so over here says, what if you did it squatting? It's just every single person is absolutely at liberty to add a suggestion, ask a question, or any such thing. Some of the team has become unbelievably great at this, and some of the team is just one of our more recent prop people. Right now she sort of mostly looks on and does what she's told. But the ones who've been around for a while, man, they really will say, well, I don't think that's going to be convincing. That sucks. You got to do something to avoid this. And there's a lot of that, I'll tell you. And it's not that we always take that suggestion, but it's that suggestion will lead to an answer. So yes, it's getting people with whom you are comfortable collaborating. And who are very observant and who are very meticulous and are willing to do a lot of work. It's a great thing.
And I also, having not at your level, but having been, it's difficult sometimes as the performer to take a suggestion or a note from somebody that isn't directly, let's say, in charge or above you, a director, for instance. It's difficult for me as a performer. So I think that speaks to both you and Penn if you have this sort of, I'm listening to everybody in order to give the audience the best experience that we can give them. I'm going to listen to everybody, and I'm not going to be the performer and you're going to be the lackey or the stagehand. We're collaborators. That's a great word, and not a word that's tossed around a lot.
It's we also Matt Donnelly, who's hanging around with us a lot lately, and he started off as a stand-up comedian, and then like 2 or 3 years ago he decided he was going to learn magic. And learned one trick from Johnny Thompson, one trick from me, one trick from Penn, one trick from this. He's now a professional magician. And Matt Donnelly is a really funny guy. And so when we're going through things, Matt will just come in and he'll say, "How about this?" Mostly it's lines with Penn, but he'll also say, at this, you need somebody to come up here on stage and do this. He's very, very good. So yeah, finding people to collaborate with that are helpful is great. Also, I mean, if you can be lucky enough to find a real director. I forget the name of the director we used the last time we were on Broadway, but he was great. He knew exactly how to address things like, is there too much talk here? How do you adjust that? How do you pick out what's essential? Which joke should you throw out? If you can find somebody with that level of taste, that's so helpful. I mean, and in a way, that's kind of mentorship too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a director currently for your show?
We do not. The closest we come right now is Matt. Matt will come in every now and then, and he'll just do notes on the show, and he'll say the really messy bit that we're working on right now is for years and years, people have always said, "Do you guys ever switch roles?" So we have a bit called Teller and Penn, in which I do the Penn part. My name is Penn Gillette, and this is my partner Teller, and we did the first night we did it. It was perfectly awful, but we followed it with something better. And then Matt came in and worked with us for a while, and night by night, it's getting better and better. Matt's very helpful in that.
Well, speaking of Penn, we'll make it quick, but because Jim is with us, Jim has been the feast master at the Minnesota Renaissance Festival for 30 plus years. And you and Penn met there. And we're just wondering what memories you have of that early experience with Penn and of wandering the dusty streets in Shakopee. Is it Shakopee? Wherever it is out there. Yeah.
Shakopee, absolutely.
Yeah.
We mention that. We mention Shakopee every night during the show.
We
do, and we have pictures of the two of us in our Renaissance Festival costumes that go up, and then always get a good howling laugh from the audience. I didn't meet Penn there. That was the first gig that we did together. I had met Penn about a year before that I think in connection with our third partner, Weir Chrisimer, who was doing his Otmar Scheck Memorial Society for the Preservation of Unusual and Disgusting Music, but that's another story. My recollections of the Renaissance Festival. Well, that was really the first place that I did that I was earning my living doing magic. Jeff Siegel was in charge in those days, and he was a Clown College friend of Penn's. And we came out and we looked at the place and we immediately said, well, we're not camping out, for crying out loud, because everybody else was like, hippies camping in tents and smoking a lot of pot. So we found ourselves a nice motel not too far away. And what else do I remember? I remember mosquitoes, plentiful mosquitoes. I remember bagpipers whose goal in life, I believe, is to disrupt the shows of somebody who might be working silently by walking directly through my crowd while I'm trying to do the tip at the end of the show, with bagpipes out full. There was some good sex there. Let's see what else. Oh yes. What do I remember? I remember steak on a steak. Yeah, that's a fine dish. A fine piece of steak marinated in Italian dressing, if I remember correctly.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Some of that we've kept. We kept the mosquitoes, for instance, and the bagpipers. A lot of the other stuff is gone now, as are you. But we certainly take a lot of joy and pride in the fact that Penn and Teller joined forces at the Minnesota Renaissance Festival. Yeah, we take a lot of pride and joy in that you guys have achieved what you achieved, but you started where we started.
It's what's great about it is the same thing that's great about street performance, which is that you get to do the show over and over again during the day. And so you start to get that flight time. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've swallowed needles, but I'm sure it's in the tens of thousands at this point. And many of those thousands were at the Minnesota Renaissance Festival. My level of authenticity might not have been quite so high, since I did use a flashlight and a dentist's mirror, which I don't believe were very popular in the
Renaissance England.
No.
Yeah.
But yeah, and Penn and I did the first show that we did together was in the headlight, was after hours for the people who were attending, who were working at the show. And it was a show that we did by the light of a couple of parked cars with their headlights on.
Good God, that's fantastic stuff for me. Really so great to spend time with both of you. Teller, I'm honored to have you on the program. Michael, always a joy to get a chance to spend a few minutes with you. And congratulations to both of you on this mentor. What's the other guy's name, Teller?
Telemachus.
The relationship that you have built for each other.
You know, the key to defining success for me is when you are earning your living, that is enough to pay for the food and the apartment and the clothes, doing what you want, the game is over. You've won.